Chapter 1166. An odd silence reigned over the atmosphere in a forest just on the outskirts of a Luxnic city. Joel, Franco and Alan stood across from Yuri and Savon, the latter two wearing nervous, fidgeting expressions. In truth, Joel was quite surprised that Yuri had managed to contact them from so far away. It had taken several hours just to get here. If not for Joel being pretty level-headed, he wouldn't have even deemed to come. But, for matters related to Lionel, he was still willing to go so far. That said, it made sense. This was Planet Luxnix, not Planet Viola. Plus, the status of these two was ties to Miel and Aina, so even if it was Planet Viola, it wasn't like they could move about as freely as they wanted. Due to these reasons, they had no choice but to contact Joel and the others from so far away. The surprising part, though, was that Yuri was actually able to accomplish such a thing. It made Joel take her just that bit more seriously. "Where is Lionel?" Yuri finally asked, somewhat unwilling to meet their gazes. In fact, much of her fidgeting was because she was trying to see if Lionel was coming or not. Yuri had left a small tag on Joel's soul force the last time they met, but she had never been able to do the same with Lionel. So, she had contacted Joel, hoping to contact Lionel through him. But, Joel didn't seem to have come with Lionel at all. This was a problem. If Lionel was truly angry, this would make things even more difficult. Visit. For a better user experience, of course, this only showed how little Yuri understood about Lionel. Is he that angry? Joel, despite his usual calm disposition, couldn't help but narrow his eyes at these words. What did she mean? Is he that angry? Setting aside the truth for a moment, so what if he was? Did he not have the right to be? The fact he hadn't exploded onto the arena stage was a proof of his self-control and nothing else. Joel reached out a hand and put it on Franco's chest, stopping him from snapping. Among the three who had come, Joel and Alan were quite level-headed, but Franco was most definitely not. Joel had made it a point not to take Raj along with them because he would only exacerbate any situation they ended up getting into, but the more rowdy of their group had insisted that at least one of them go because they didn't trust Joel and Alan to say the harsh things when they needed to be said. That said, they knew that this was a gross exaggeration. The current Joel and Alan were just as enraged as any one of them. Seeing the expressions of the three men before her, Yuri's own flickered, making her feel that maybe she had said something wrong. Your words show just how little you understand about Lionel, but that isn't your fault. You're just the friend of the woman he liked, not the woman herself. The one who deserves the blame is her. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Yuri's jaw clenched. Just the same way Raj was willing to go overboard in protecting Lionel, even saying many things he shouldn't have said, Yuri was much the same way with Aina. In fact, compared to the time Lionel's brothers had spent by his side, Yuri had been with Aina even longer. However, this time, she took deep breaths, realizing that letting her temper flare like it had before would only be detrimental to her goal. You all have to understand that this matter isn't what it looks like. Joel's brow furrowed, but he chose to continue to listen instead of interjecting. The truth of the matter was that if Joel had told Lionel that Yuri wanted to talk, Lionel probably would have come. And even if Lionel chose not to come, it wouldn't be because he was furious, it would only be because he felt that his time was better applied to something else. Joel knew better than most that what Lionel was feeling right now wasn't rage, it was indifference. If he felt that his time was better spent training and meditating, he wouldn't come. If he was curious enough to hear what Yuri would say, then it would come. It was that simple. However, Joel knew well, at the same time, that there was a very lowly, maybe 0% probability, that Lionel would change his mind purely on what Yuri would say. Knowing this, Joel chose not to waste Lionel's time. The three of them already had been booted from the second day of competition, they had nothing to lose wasting time like this. So, he listened to Yuri's story from start to finish. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. So you mean to say that Aina's father agreed to this marriage for the sake of a position to enter the Void Palace selection? But this was a lie because anyone could participate anyway. Joel summarized. Yes, yes. Yuri wrung her hands together. But they lied. The marriage was only supposed to take place after the selection, but Richard used a loophole in the agreement to place it after the first day of the selection. Also, the deal wasn't of equivalent exchange because there was no quota this year to begin with. Even Savon and I could participate. Joel, Alan and Franco watched in silence and Yuri continued to explain herself. They didn't interrupt her and didn't shift her gaze away. The only one of the two who seemed to realize that something was wrong with the atmosphere was Savon, who could only sigh inwardly. Yuri loved Aina too much. She was unwilling for Aina to take any sort of losses, even if others had to suffer for it. The same way Lionel's brothers thought that Aina was unworthy of him, just how much more so did Yuri believe the vice versa, albeit subconsciously? And what do you want us to do about this, exactly? Joel asked. We have to save her. I saw earlier that Lionel's grandmother is very powerful. If she works together with my adoptive father, can't we kidnap Aina before the wedding? A pregnant silence fell over the forest. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. So let me get this straight. Franco began to speak, this time not receiving the interruption of Joel. Your friend wanted to spread her legs for a chance to move up in the world, but now that she's been played she wants everyone to risk their lives to save her from one of the strongest families in the sector. Did I get that right? Chapter 1167. Yuri was stunned for a moment before she suddenly imploded. What the hell did you just say? Bang! A violent invisible force shot out in all directions. The expressions of the three young men instantly changed as they hurried to protect themselves, but it was already too late. As though a wall of solid wind had hit them, they flew backward like an iron ball out of a cannon. In fact, it wasn't just them. The surrounding nature was completely flattened as though a fist had descended from the sky. The rippling wave spread outward like a fan, sending the three flying for dozens of meters. Yuri. Savon was shocked awake. Savon violently pulled Yuri backward, disrupting the eruption of her fury. Then, she sprung forward at her fastest speed, her force reaching out to slow the blow the three had suffered. She barely made it in time to ensure that they didn't crash against the ground or any thick trees, however that didn't stop the three of them from coughing up blood. Savon had reacted far too slowly to stop the initial impact. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Yuri was still furious enough to go for another attack. Unfortunately, Savon was standing in the path between herself and the three. Although she had plenty of methods of going around Savon, she had a feeling that being so close, Savon would definitely try to block her. Joel, Alan and Franco coughed out another mouthful of blood, their gazes lit with fury. Savon, get out of the way. Yuri yelled. This bitch. Franco growled, about to get up. Just when it seemed like things would truly get out of hand, Savon turned back toward Yuri, her gaze livid. For a moment, she seemed to return to that same fiery-tempered girl who always reprimanded Lionel for chasing after Aina. You've done enough. Step back. Savon's near roar shocked Yuri out of her own rage and even made Franco take a pause. He was already furious enough to go all out with this woman, but Savon's actions seemed to snap them all awake. Savon turned back toward the boys, kneeling down. She handed them all healing pills she had managed to accumulate, allowing their injuries to stabilize. Visit. For a better user experience, I'm sorry about Yuri, but she treats Aina like her own flesh and blood sister. She often says and does things she doesn't mean when it comes to her, but please hear me out. She didn't tell you the full scope of the truth and how things ended up this way. Savon. Yuri's expression changed. Yuri wasn't a fool. She didn't speak about those matters on purpose because the less people that knew, the better. Not only did it involve a treasure that Meal could be hunted down for, if Aina didn't interact with the world as normally as possible, it was possible that it would have adverse reactions on the reawakening of her personality. If it wasn't for the fact Savon was so close with Aina and would immediately realize that there was something wrong with her personality, she wouldn't have been told the truth of the circumstances either. Yuri had naively only ever seen things from her perspective. In her mind, Aina was perfect and everyone should treat her as such, not to mention care about her well-being just as much as she did. So, she had never considered telling them the full story because she didn't think it was necessary. Wasn't what she had said enough? Wasn't it clear as day that Aina had been wronged? Then how could they possibly act like it wasn't a big deal? How could they say such cruel words? What Yuri couldn't wrap her head around was something that Savon understood almost too intimately. It could be said that of all the people who understood best how Lionel felt right now, Savon was at the top of the list. Unlike Yuri, Savon had been thrust into this world just like Lionel had, forced to scratch and claw for everything and even barely surviving her first zone. And, just like Lionel, she had walked out to find her best friend of 4 years with her bloodied arm through a human's chest. That event had caused Savon to become estranged from Yuri and Aina. And yet, instead of trying to bring her back into the fold and support her in the moment she needed it the most, they both left her. Visit. For a better user experience, Aina left to go off on her adventures with Lionel, and Yuri only ever truly cared about Aina's well-being, not considering Savon very much at all. If Savon hadn't felt the need to step in during the argument between Lionel's brothers and Aina, maybe they would have all remained estranged for a lifetime. And what had happened after that? Well, the broken and fragile Aina collapsed in her arms, sobbing and crying her worries away, pining over a man she herself had chosen to leave. She brought Savon out like a crutch, even dragging her to this sixth-dimensional world so she could continue to be used. When Aina hadn't needed Savon anymore, she was fine with ignoring her existence. But, the moment she had, she dragged her back into her life, forcing her to become a shoulder to cry on. Did Savon understand that Aina was a broken person? Yes. Did she understand that it wasn't entirely Aina's fault? Yes. Did she blame Aina and hate her like another might? No. However, none of this changed the fact that it hurt. No one ever considered her thoughts and her feelings. Despite having friends around, she felt like she was alone. She had spent 4 years protecting Aina, but she never received the same in return. There was no one else who understood how Lionel felt right this moment more than she did. But even now, she was willing to help. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, so, she explained. The only details she missed were ones that she had never been privy to, but whether it was related to how broken Aina was after leaving Lionel, all the way up to her personality being completely erased, she left nothing out. When she was finished, the 3 young men looked toward one another. They hadn't expected to have had the needle moved for them at all. But now, what were they supposed to do? Chapter 1168. Joel took a deep breath. This changed the dynamic of a lot of things, but he wasn't sure of how to proceed from here. For one, the Viola family was far too powerful. The fact that they had moved the wedding up on purpose without regard for meal meant that they were already determined to do this. It was clear that after the elders of the Viola family saw Aina's talent, they were determined to make her theirs. But, this was just one aspect of it. Even if they had known this before, Franco would have still said what he said earlier. The fact that Aina wasn't entirely in control of her faculties, though, was something that made even them hesitate. The choice was made by Aina's father to begin with, not Aina. And it seemed that Aina agreed because she saw the logic behind it. Richard wasn't worth much to her before, but if he was a ticket to the Void Palace, then it made sense to her. As for matters of love, she hadn't even considered it. Joel shook his head. I don't know, I can't guarantee anything. I can only say that we'll speak with Lionel and Granny Roja. Maybe there is something they can do. Maybe if it had been before the first day's selection, Joel and the others would have been ready to wade through hell or high water, not for Aina, but just so that Lionel would have a chance at happiness. The odds a man would be able to get over his first love marrying and lying with another man was minimal at best. And, for someone like Lionel, Just the attempt toward the action alone was enough for him to shut down and not mind it anymore. But just earlier today, they had all received a rude awakening. All the pride they had had from their accomplishments in the Milky Way flew away like dust in a storm. They were nothing but ants here. They had barely gained the ability to fight against the geniuses of branch families. How could they possibly challenge the older generation of a pillar family like the Viola? Savon smiled a complicated smile. It had a hint of bitterness to it, but it was mostly filled with understanding. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The truth was that Meal hadn't even sent them here. It was Yuri who realized that something must have gone wrong, causing her to come here of her own accord. She knew her adoptive father well and knew that he wouldn't put Aina in danger on purpose. He likely wanted to use Richard, and then when she was accepted by the Void Palace, throw him away. The trouble was that while Meal had spent most of his time training, pining after a day he could get revenge for his late wife, Richard had been embroiled in political schemes since he was a boy. How could Meal outsmart Richard? Richard saw through his plan with a glance and adjusted accordingly. Without the halo of Void Palace disciple around her, Richard had no need to worry about forcing Aina to do anything. And, because he was alone and this marriage had been accepted by the elders of the Viola family, Meal couldn't snatch Aina away openly without being hunted down and killed. This left Meal with very little options and Aina with even fewer. Ultimately, they were all at a loss for what to do. Yip. Yip. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel smiled as little Blackstar raced around his hands, arms and shoulders, messing about with little Tolly. The two still had their rivalry and it only seemed to grow stronger after little Blackstar awoke from his comatose state. Still, though they seemed to be at each other's throats, Lionel could faintly feel that little Tolly had missed little Blackstar. The two little toddlers might as well have been the closest of blood brothers. Lionel was happy that he had his own brothers as well. Being an only child could have very well been too lonely if he hadn't. Ah, be careful, don't touch that. Little Blackstar almost nicked the blade of a sword Lionel was working on. One would have thought that Lionel would be honing his skill, maybe practicing some more of the Luxnix family force arts. But, nope. He was crafting. The sword looked like it was straight out of Grecian times. It was quite short, being only about 1.5 feet long. Its body was narrower near the hilt and thicker near its tip before ending at a point, giving it a sleek sort of S-shaped curve. It had a bronze blade and a delicate wood handle that was immaculately carved. But, maybe its most astounding feature was that the air seemed to tremble around it, almost distorting reality everywhere it passed. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Without Lionel even telling him, Blackstar suddenly sensed danger, rolling into a ball and vanishing into space before appearing high in the air. His beady black eyes looked down, his whiskers flickering between apprehension and curiosity. Little Blackstar didn't feel like he would die from that blade, but he definitely felt that he would get hurt. In fact, he felt that he would be hurt even if he used his incorporeal ability. Blackstar was used to being immune to most attacks because he could just displace his body into his shadow world. But, for some reason, that sword seemed to be able to ignore him, even attack him while he was in there. Lionel reached out and grabbed the sword, balancing it on a finger. It's just a prototype, but it's pretty good. Lionel spoke with little Blackstar. If I made weapons like this, it would be good. The problem is that this sort of blade can only last one battle before its own destructive capability eats away at the metal it was made from. A shame. I'm not sure if I could fix that, it would take quite some research. Yip. Yip. Lionel laughed. I can make you some claw gauntlets like this if you want. But, they would probably have the same issue. Plus, don't you think you scare your enemies enough? Yip. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Blackstar shook his head furiously. Clearly, the little guy wasn't satisfied. Chapter 1169. Lionel laughed again, flicking his finger and sending the sword spiraling upward. With a dull slapping sound, Lionel grabbed the sword by its hilt and sent it flying forward. A soothing whistle sound filled the air, only to be interrupted by the sound of blade meeting wood. A tree in the distance was directly split in the middle, and it seemed that the sword might continue traveling right through it. But it was at that moment that something astonishing happened. As though it had been burnt from the inside out, the tree crumbled into a pile of ash, collapsing to the ground in a heap. The sword continued into the distance before falling not far afterward. Unfortunately, the ground it landed upon became like an ash land of death. The greenery withered, the rich soil turned to harsh granules, and a crater formed and collapsed, the weakened ground falling in on itself. Lionel whistled, the result being slightly more exaggerated than even he expected. Of course, this weapon was the result of Lionel applying what he had grasped from his innate node. It was just a low-level destruction force art, but the result was quite devastating. Though that was just a normal tree and ground, and the crater wasn't very large, barely half a meter in radius, they were both still tempered by a six-dimensional world even if they weren't anything special. To have them crumble like that. Well, it spoke for itself. The only trouble was, almost as soon as the crater began to collapse, as though it had used up all its energy, the sword crumbled soon afterward. Lionel didn't even bother to go after it, he knew it was finished. Visit. For a better user experience, as he had expected, weapons he incorporated these sort of force arts into would have a short shelf life. He had predicted that they would last maybe one battle, but judging by the result, it might not last even that long. They might be good as a trump card, but as a main mode of battle, Lionel didn't think they could be trusted. On top of this, they were expensive. Just to survive as long as it did, Lionel was forced to forge the sword of the sixth dimension ore he had gotten from Patriarch Averon Radix's body. When he had tried the same thing with a fifth dimension ore, it didn't even make it past the production stage. There were, of course, other problems as well. For instance, it wasn't scalable since Lionel was definitely the only one who could craft them. On top of that, they were obviously dangerous. Lionel wasn't sure how easy it would be for others to harm themselves with it. The destructive power is undeniable. I might just need to stick to using it with arrows and maybe bullets if I ever decide to go that route again. The Tier 9 gold bow should be able to handle firing those arrows up to a certain point. The only trouble is, where am I going to find so much six-dimensional ore? Lionel shook his head. Maybe instead of trying to find such things, he should instead focus on finding ores better suited to withstanding the destruction force arts. Alright, I'll leave this be for now. There's at least a proof of concept. I think I'll turn my attention back to the Luxnix family force art system now. Lionel's mind was like a machine working on the best sort of fuel. Everything was so clear to him, and his minds worked separately and in unison completely seamlessly. He let little Tolly go play with little Blackstar, and he reallocated the minds he had put toward crafting back toward analyzing the ins and outs of this new force art system. One might think that this wasn't worth it. After all, Lionel's mother knew of the Luxnix force art system, yet all of her most powerful techniques used the Camelot magic system instead. So, wasn't it better to focus on the latter? Visit. For a better user experience, but Lionel saw it differently. After speaking with his grandmother and consulting the dictionary, he understood a bit more about the world spirit. The reason why all of his mother's most powerful techniques utilized Camelot system and not the Luxnix was because she had Earth's world spirit, not the three-pillar world's world spirit, which was divided between the three families. Simply put, his mother had perfectly grasped Camelot's magic system without even trying to its greatest depths. In fact, she was only limited by her current dimension level. When it came to the Luxnix, though, her comprehension was shallow by comparison. Realizing this, Lionel understood that there was still great potential in the Luxnix system. Just when Lionel was about to completely close himself off again, he looked up, realizing that his brothers were all approaching him with complicated looks in their eyes. Lionel blinked. What's wrong with you all? Joel shook his head. He was certain that Lionel already had a guess, probably multiple. But, he still started to speak. Leo, this is how things are. Lionel listened silently, not interrupting even once. His expression wasn't cold or indifferent, he simply looked like he was listening to a friend tell him a story. He nodded from time to time and even hummed in agreement depending on the circumstances. If one didn't know just how much all of this should have mattered to Lionel, they would have never thought there was anything wrong with his actions. Visit. For a better user experience. The decision is up to you. Joel finally said. I'm with you, Cap, Raj supplemented. After hearing the truth behind things, even Raj couldn't help but change his tune. In fact, he felt kind of bad for being so hard on her. But, in the end, the one he would follow would always be Lionel, even if it was at the expense of Aina. Still. Being cursed from childhood, losing your mother, and effectively your father. Dealing with that sort of pain for a lifetime and having your insecurities amplified day after day. Raj couldn't help but be sympathetic. I see. Lionel nodded and remained silent for a moment before continuing. Unfortunately, I have no intention of saving her. All those years ago, Lionel had made his stance very clear to Aina. In fact, he remembered the exact words he had spoken that day. I know you have a heavy burden on your heart. All I want you to know is that I'm here to bear it with you. I just want you to trust me, lean on me. Never go off on your own and do something stupid because I will not come to save you. Do you understand me? Those words, he had spoken them and he had meant them. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1170. Joel sighed when he heard these words. He had already expected as much, but hearing it so clearly like this made him feel that it was unfortunate. Sometimes, Joel felt like there was some sort of god looking down on them and pulling these strings, making certain that they all looked as foolish as possible at any given time for their sick form of entertainment. For a long while, they thought that Aina was completely unworthy of Lionel. And, truth be told, she hadn't really done much to change their opinion aside from becoming extraordinarily beautiful. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to move the needle for Lionel. Now, in an irony of ironies, it was they who wanted Lionel to step up. Of course, this wasn't for Aina's sake, but Joel believed that she was truly Lionel's best chance at happiness. Or, at the very least, if they didn't end up together, Lionel deserved some better form of closure than this. And yet, it was now Lionel who wanted no part of it. Lionel hadn't even bothered to say a word to Aina. They weren't face to face when she left, and he didn't even look in her direction after hearing Richard's announcement. No matter how you spun it, they just found it impossible to feel that such a thing was healthy. Joel wondered how they would take things from here. On one side, he wanted to support Lionel and his decision. After all, it was still Lionel's right to decide how they dealt with these matters. But, on the other, he didn't want Lionel to decide on something he would regret for a lifetime. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Unfortunately, Joel felt that Lionel wasn't a normal person by any stretch. If it was someone else, Joel might think that they were just being vindictive and wanted their significant other to suffer just as much as they had, taking responsibility for their own decisions. But, he simply couldn't find any rage in Lionel's eyes at all. No matter how good of an actor a person was, it was simply impossible for them to mask such a fresh wound so easily. Joel never got the chance to make his decision, though. Because Lionel's next words seemed to close off any sort of chance they had. I know that you all might try to do something, thinking it to be in my best interest, but I hope that you won't. Lionel's gaze gained a sincere and patient light to it. I do not want my brothers to risk their lives, and the same goes with my grandmother. I only just began to reform a relationship with her and her body is quite frail now, she's no longer in her prime. Though my grandmother is powerful, she's not nearly as powerful as she once was and she's currently stuck at a bottleneck she can't break past. She has a lot of guilt on her shoulders even though I do not blame her. If you bring this possibility to her, I'm certain that she will go all out for a chance at giving me happiness. But, I need you all to understand that this path won't bring me happiness. If anything, it will lose me brothers and there's an over 80% likelihood that it will lose me my grandmother. Lionel matched each one of their gazes. He wasn't pressuring any of them, but he wanted to convey his feelings as clearly as possible. When he laid out the truth so plainly and succinctly, the expressions of the boys couldn't help but change several times. Visit. For a better user experience, they subconsciously knew how dangerous these matters would be, but hearing it explained like this truly made them understand what kind of game they were trying to play. I can understand Aina's plight, however the risk is not worth the reward. I can't trade the lives of people I care about for the life of someone. I simply don't. Joel and the others felt their hearts tremble when they heard this. But it made Lionel's stance as clear as day. There was simply nothing else they could do to refute it. Judging by Lionel's tone, even though he didn't say it, if he felt that they were about to take action, he would stop them. He knew the date of the wedding just as well as they did, and it would only be a day from now. There was simply no time for them to devise any sort of plan that could fool Lionel. And even if they could, should they? Lionel sighed. I don't want these matters to weigh on you all, but I can't force it to not either. If it makes you all feel better, the current Aina can snap Richard like a twig, and she's completely immune to poisons due to her ability. Unless one of the Viola family elders stands in their wedding chambers, no one could force her to do anything she doesn't want to do. And if she does want to do it, why should you all be the ones to worry about it? Just focus on your training. We have much bigger things to worry about and much bigger goals in mind. The 8 looked toward one another and nodded. Maybe this was the best way to look at things. Visit. For a better user experience, they alone didn't have the strength to even think of challenging the Viola. And they had no right to put Lionel's grandmother in danger when he explicitly asked them not to. How would they even face Lionel if they came back with Aina but his grandmother was dead? What if he cut them off just like he had James? In the end, there was nothing they could do. The hours continued to tick by. Lionel spent a few moments relaxing with his brothers, mostly at their insistence, before he returned to refining his comprehension of the Luxnix Force art system. While part of his mind was on this, another part was on something completely different, though. Her father had something capable of erasing her personality, huh? Sparks flew within Lionel's dreamscape. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, 73% probability that it is another tablet based on currently available information. So, how do I get my hands on it? Chapter 1171. Lionel could think of a few plans, but judging by the fact that Aina's father was definitely well into the 6th dimension, he would have to be choosy with which one he approached things with. I also have to consider the possibility that her father is also aware of my own silver tablet. When Lionel was in a relationship with Aina, he didn't hide anything from her, that included the existence of the silver tablet. Not only did Aina know of it, but she was also well aware of all its abilities and even the details on how Lionel ended up with it. Savon also mentioned that it was a bronze tablet. Is there a difference in strength with the color? It's possible, but there aren't enough data points. It could also be related to the type of power it has instead rather than anything else. But if they both have the ability to wipe personalities, maybe not. The easiest method was maybe to force Meal to exchange the tablet for saving Aina. This may work. I wouldn't even have to save her, I would only need to stall the wedding. Judging by how things are going, the Viola are likely invested in Aina's talent. That means that regardless of who her husband ends up being, their main goal is to ensure that she remains within their family. Because of how close the event days are, if I sneak into the Viola family compound and kill Richard, the Viola would have no choice but to postpone the wedding. The optics of forcing a woman to marry someone else right after their fiancé died would be terrible. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Of course, there's also the chance the Viola wouldn't care. But, even then, they would still need to wait a day or two. By then, the second day of the selection would begin. Aina would have to participate, so there would be opportunity for her father to snatch her away and bring her to safety. This was the first plan Lionel thought of, but there were a few issues. For one, if it was so easy to get to Richard and kill him, Meal would have probably done so personally already. However, the reason Lionel thought it was still possible was because the Viola family was well aware that they had offended Miel. They would always be on guard against him. The other problem was how Lionel would sneak in to begin with. Yuri and Savon were probably having their movements monitored by now. In fact, if the Viola were smart, they would already know everything about their movements to begin with. They definitely know that Yuri and Savon contacted Joel and the others. That would put them even more on guard and makes things even more difficult. Seems like it's not worth it. The risk-to-reward ratio wasn't there. Lionel refused to put his grandmother's life in danger, which meant he would have to do it himself. And though he was confident, he wasn't foolish. Not only was there a high likelihood he would die while the Viola were on alert, but the reward in return was likely not to be worth it. If the bronze tablet was just a weaker replica of his silver tablet, he would gain nothing from this. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience in that case, we need to minimize the risk more. Ana's father should be present during the second and third days of the selection. I think I can modify a force art technique of the Luxnix into a perfect tracker. By then, I can just deal with him and take the tablet away when I'm strong enough. It probably won't take long. Lionel's force surged, forming delicate tendrils. Soon, a spider the size of a fingernail appeared on his palm. It scurried around under his control before touching Lionel's spatial ring and vanishing within it. Lionel closed his eyes and made some quick calculations. Several problems need to be fixed. First, I'll modify the shell of the spider. It needs to be more transparent to the point where any light that touches it goes right through. Alright, I'll adjust this point here. Though it won't be perfectly invisible, it won't be a problem under my control. The second issue is that crossing the spatial barrier of a treasure weakens it considerably. That cuts down the effective range significantly and it would deteriorate to nothingness in just a few days. I'll have to change the base element of the creation into the spatial element and have it fuse with the spatial force of the ring, creating a sort of symbiotic relationship. That way, so long as the ring lives, the spider will live. The solution to the second problem should also fix the third. So long as the spider and ring become one, the ring itself will become a beacon and signal only I can see and hear. Perfect. Lionel sat in silence for several moments, his calculations finishing in rapid succession. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. His eyes opened and his dream force surged once more. This time, it almost looked as though nothing at all appeared on Lionel's palm. But, even if you looked closely, it almost looked like a droplet of fresh water. It was only after Lionel activated the second awakening of his wisdom branch and his eyes sharpened that he could see the beautiful crystalline body of the little spider. Excellent. I should be able to pick out Ana's father based on the energy signature of the Brazinger family when the time comes. I've seen and met enough of them. Lionel nodded to himself and didn't mind this matter anymore. So long as he and Miel were on the same planet, he would be able to find him with this method. As for the matters with Ana, he no longer needed to worry about them. Whether she got married or not had nothing to do with him. The minutes turned to hours and then days. Soon, it was the surprise event many had been waiting for, and the marriage union of Ana Brazinger and Richard Viola was here. Those who had gotten themselves a place in the arena soon began to appear in the Viola estate one after another. If it wasn't for the fact that many other sectors were also having their selections now, they would have likely sent representatives of their own as well. The grand event was beginning. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel, however, was in his penthouse suite, having finally begun to take his rest seriously. He snored lightly and peacefully, his head resting on a cloud of pillows. Chapter 1172. Ana sat within a luxurious room upon a well-cushioned stool. Before her, a mirror lay, reflecting her image back to her. In her palm, there was a pair of scissors. She held them open and up to her hair, thinking about how short she should cut it. But, for some reason, she was hesitating. It's a bit amusing. She thought to herself. If I really was a vampire, I wouldn't have a reflection at all, now would I? It was a completely random and almost painfully childish thought. Ever since she woke from her sleep, Aina had found her long hair very annoying. She couldn't use it to attack like some other people with weird abilities, and she always had to compensate for it in battle so that her opponent couldn't take advantage. She couldn't for the life of her understand why she had allowed it to get so long. What was especially frustrating was that every time she entered her peak battle state, her vitality would be stimulated and it would grow even longer. By then, she would have to trim the ends just to make sure she wasn't sweeping the ground with her every step. My facial structure is pretty good, I could probably pull off going completely bald. As Aina was lost in thought, she heard the sound of footsteps and her door clicking open. She lowered the scissors in her hand, forgetting her original purpose as she met the gaze of the person who had entered through the mirror. The current Yuri was red and puffy-eyed. She didn't look like she had gotten an ounce of sleep, but for someone as powerful as her, missing out on a single night's rest shouldn't have been enough to put her in such a state. Visit. For a better user experience, as though she had to sneak around, she carefully closed the door behind her and locked it soon afterward. Her chest beat so wildly that it seemed that her heart might fly from her chest. Aina, Yuri's voice almost carried with it a pleading tone. Looking at her friend, no, her sister of so long, she felt as though someone was stabbing her through the heart repeatedly. The current Aina looked as beautiful as an angel. The custom of white wedding dresses of Earth wasn't shared here, but none of that stopped her from shining like she was her own star. She wore a dress of violet that wrapped around her proud peaks tightly before falling somewhat loosely down her hips and legs. Her delicate shoulders were adorned by a silk shawl embroidered with patterns of purple blooming flowers, and her forehead wore a minimalistic crown of gold. Her hair was meant to be done up with a very special hair pin reserved for the ladies of the Viola family who shared similarly high status. This job was to fall into Yuri's hands, but judging by her appearance, she wanted to use this chance to speak of something else entirely. Aina blinked. Her gaze looked Yuri up and down, seemingly trying to analyze something. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. You can't go through with this. Aina's head tilted. Didn't we already have this conversation yesterday? Why are we having it again? Hearing such a response, Yuri felt like banging her head against a wall. She knew that she shouldn't be doing this, she should be allowing Aina to stumble and fall on her own, just like one would in real life. Only this way would she be able to rebuild her personality the way it had been before. But Yuri just couldn't accept this. Aina was her treasure, the one person she respected to the depths of her soul, maybe even more than her own adoptive father. She had watched Aina go through so much as nothing more than a little girl. She couldn't stand the idea of her image and sense of self being tainted in this way. Plus, who went through life without receiving any sort of advice? Miel knew of the danger of Aina not reawakening to her true self soon enough, so he took a hands-off approach, trying to expedite Aina's growth by allowing her to maneuver through situations alone. But then hadn't he been forced to step in due to the Void Palace anyway? Everything was a mess. Everyone seemed to be trying to do their best with what they were given, but life and circumstances kept forcing them to trip and fall. Aina, Yuri said with more urgency. If she couldn't get Aina to agree, any sort of escape plan was meaningless. If the person in question didn't cooperate, any small chance they had was nil. Visit. For a better user experience, the truth was that Yuri knew it was helpless. After 2 days, they had no plan. Miel hadn't said anything to her, she had contacted Joel again only to learn that Lionel had refused, and now there was no one but her and Savon. In fact, if it wasn't for Savon stalling the other maids, she wouldn't even be able to be here to speak to Aina alone and give it one more try. Yuri, I know you worry for me, but there is really no need. The likelihood of escaping the Viola is near zero, and even if we do, we'll be hunted down. The only escape would be getting accepted by the Void Palace, but why would the Viola allow me to continue to participate if we somehow manage to escape? It's one thing to run away, but if there's a location they know we have to be at, what good would that do? Aina's words had suddenly gone from overly childish to coldly calculative. Yuri grit her teeth. At least At least do what I asked and speak to Lionel through me. If you have his grandmother's help, there'll be little the Void Palace can do to stop you from participating. Aina looked toward Yuri as though she was looking at a naive little baby. Didn't you see how the Luxniks treated them? If Richard asks a favor of the Luxniks, do you think she could stop the combined might of the Luxniks and Viola all on her own? Plus, I've already said I won't contact him. Why not? Yuri completely lost her cool, unable to hold it back any longer. This isn't the time for pride. This is your life we're talking about. Visit. For a better user experience, Aina shook her head. Because he's a man of his word. He said he wouldn't come, so he won't come. Yuri felt that all her air had been forcefully pulled out from her body as she fell to the floor. Chapter 1173. The hall the Viola had chosen for the wedding wasn't much of a hall at all. There was no ceiling and the ambience was only enclosed by tall pillars holding up nothing more than the sky. The grass was a fantastical shade of violet, the waters shared a light shade of pink, and the trees in the surroundings all had white bark and delicate silver leaves. The picturesque scenery seemed like it was pulled right out of a fairy tale. Even with the thousands of guests present, with even more still coming, no one seemed willing to ruin the sheer beauty of it all. The conversation filling the air was often quite benign and uninteresting. But, of those that were worthy of note, many revolved around this curious turn of events. The marriage of a crown heir was most definitely worth at least this much fanfare. The trouble was, there actually wasn't enough of it. For an event of this scale, it should have been announced months ago. Pillar families and organizations from across several sectors should have made an appearance, and the wife in question should have been a well-known figure for ages. After being blindsided by this information, many began to look into this Aina Brazinger character, and her background only made them more curious. She was the daughter of a vassal of the family, but it wasn't an eternal vassal, but rather a first-generation one. This was quite surprising. Outside of this, she didn't seem to have any other background. Her mother was unknown and presumed dead, while her father was quite low profile. The only standout feature, aside from her overwhelming beauty, was her merits in clearing zones. Unfortunately, information on this was quite scarce and guarded. Though, this made perfect sense. After all, the highest-rated zone Aina had entered for the sake of the Viola was one related to the Silver Empire. This was obviously information she kept close to herself, and whatever she was forced to disclose was kept well by the Viola family. The only reason everyone didn't assume that Aina was a flower in a vase, picked out by Richard because of his lust, was because her performance during the first day of the selection had spoken for itself. How could any of them look down on what they had seen that day? Visit. For a better user experience, that said, this didn't stop those with nothing better to do from placing her firmly atop the list of this sector's beauties, a list that contained women who hadn't moved their positions in several decades. On this list, there were princesses of families, famous entertainers, and even the spouses of some of the most powerful men of the three-pillar sector. And yet, she was placed number 1. Among the growing crowd, Gradier sat in silence. Every so often, someone would send him a look of disdain or pity, but he simply pretended as though he hadn't seen anything at all. Ever since he lost the battle for crown heir, he had been fairly silent. He didn't reprimand his younger brother for being his Achilles' heel, nor did he snap. He continued about his business as though nothing had happened and like he hadn't lost something he had spent his whole life working toward. Today, he sat at a wedding that may very well should have been for him had things not gone the way they had gone, but he continued to respect the rules of etiquette and took his loss in silence. He too had participated in the selection and managed to get a spot on the second day, but so had many other members of the Viola family. There was nothing special about his achievement and it flew under the radar as usual. He was never as calculating as Richard, but he was a man with his own pride and he would continue to act as such. The inflow of people began to slow. The number of invitees was easily pushing 10,000, making this a truly grand event. They all took their seats and began to wait patiently, their eyes sparkling as they laid eyes on the large purple lily that stood upon the large platform ahead. It had veins of gold and shimmering petals that swayed gently in the wind. It was the perfect centerpiece for such a grand wedding. Visit. For a better user experience, and then, the delicate sound of music began to play. In a separate location within the Viola estate, the atmosphere wasn't nearly as lively or beautiful. The lights were dark and the air was especially heavy, the scent of blood and sweat leaving a thick stench in the air. Standing tall, there were 4 men. Of them, 3 were well into their middle ages and the last was a youth just entering his prime. Among the 3 middle-aged men, 2 seemed particularly subordinate to the last, but this didn't change just how powerful they were individually. Without fail, all 4 of these men had flickering violet irises, carrying with them a depth of amethyst that danced between the vibrant color and the shade of black. Of the 2 weaker middle-aged men, one was particularly tall, his chin, jaw and cheeks covered by the shadow of a short and scruffy beard. His posture would remind Lionel of Hephaestus and he seemed to contain the same hidden explosive power within his limbs. The latter was quite fat and stocky, having such a large belly that one would have trouble understanding just how he walked through doorways. However, rather than jiggling, his belly was like a bronze cauldron, hardly shifting at all with his movement. These 2 men were none other than eternal vassal Rojan and Chindi. And that made the identity of the last all the more obvious. The strongest of the eternal vassals and the right-hand man of Patriarch Viola. Eternal Vassal O'Brien. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. And yet, right this moment, they were all gasping for breath, their bodies beaten and bloodied, many of their bones broken, and standing amongst a litter of corpses around them. To think that even after being schemed against to this extent, poisoned, trapped within a formation designed specifically for him, and sapped of his right to gather force from the atmosphere, it would still take so much to slow him down to this extent. The young man spoke slowly, his gaze flickering. If he wasn't so cautious and hadn't prepared so many contingencies, there was simply no way this would have succeeded. Among the dead, there were even countless main family members. The Viola had actually lost 20% of their 6th-dimensional experts to this one battle. He almost couldn't believe it. If the Viola elder knew they would take such a loss, they would have never done this. But, who could have known that this person would actually have hidden so much of their strength? The young man's head tilted up, familiar music drifting to his ears. Hearing this, his frown faded and his smile returned. In that case, I guess I'll have to thank you for your efforts by marrying your daughter. The young man turned and flashed away. There was no doubt that this young man was Richard. As for the man beaten to within half an inch of his life, lying chained to the ground before them all. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, it was none other than Meal, Adam Rainier Brazinger, Ana's father. Chapter 1174. The music drifted throughout the Viola estate. Yuri, who had barely cobbled her emotions back together, found herself crying once more. It was like the beautiful sound of plucking strings and warm horns was instead the call of death to her ears. Her fingers trembled as she tried to delicately form the strands of Ana's hair. Step by step, her long hair became an elaborate bun. If it wasn't for how blurry Yuri's vision was, she would probably think it was really beautiful. Luckily, she still had her internal sight to rely on, or else she would be a true mess. As steadily as she could, she placed the ornament of Viola family women atop Ana's hair, completing her hairdo. This dress is a bit uncomfortable. It would be easiest if there was at least one slit down the leg. Ana spoke to herself, having long since realized that Yuri was beyond saving. If this was a life or death situation, she might just have to leave her behind completely. The childish and out-of-place thoughts in Ana's head didn't seem to stop. She hadn't made any sort of progress at all. Yuri pulled away, trying hard to control her breathing. At that moment, there was a light clicking noise as the doors opened once again. Yuri's head snapped back like a frightened kitten. But, when she saw that it was Savon, the rock on her chest instead got heavier than lighter. It suddenly hit her that the opportunity Savon had gotten for her was wasted once again. She hadn't been able to budge Ana at all. Savon, seeing Yuri's pale, tear-streaked face, sighed, realizing the truth without having to hear it explained to her. Deflated, Yuri collapsed onto a nearby couch. Soon, the maids Savon had distracted would likely come back. And, with the music playing, it likely wouldn't be more than 5 minutes before Richard was here to truly begin things. The marriage ceremonies of the Viola weren't very heavy on tradition. Outside of the hair-piece heirloom, there wasn't much to abide by. However, there were still its own set of rules. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. This grace period of music that was playing now was actually for the people to give their well wishes and blessings to the couple before the ceremony began. During this time, a silence would fall over the wedding hall and a peaceful meditation would take place. Beneath this silence and the music, the flower centerpiece would begin to bloom. The blooming of the flower represented the budding of lifelong happiness. Once the flower was on the verge of blooming, the soon-to-be husband and wife pair would walk down the aisle together. Their walk would be timed with the final blooming of the flower, and their stepping onto the stage would coincide with the maturity of said flower. The timing and control of all of this was taken under the man's lead. As he would be the head of the household, it was his responsibility to take on. The better timing the husband had, the stronger his leadership skills and the more blessings the flower would bestow upon their union. Of course, Richard would never ruin the timing of his own wedding, so there was no way that he would be late. And, even if he was, no one was naive enough to believe that the Viola didn't have their own methods of making sure that this tradition of theirs was followed to the greatest degree possible. There were definitely many tricks and techniques they could use to slow or speed up the progress. In the end, there were no real blessings to be had, it was just a hint of superstition from an olden age and a ceremonial practice. They had all already run out of time. It was over. Savon sighed. Forcing a smile, she walked to Aina's back, meeting her gaze through the mirror. You look very beautiful. You will make Richard very happy. Aina blinked. I'm not interested in making him happy. Oh. Savon raised her brows. And why is that? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. It seems foolish to worry about the happiness of someone that doesn't really care about your own happiness. Aina responded as though it was very obvious. Isn't it very hard to make someone you don't know happy? Savon asked. What makes you happy? Fighting and eating. Aina replied with a beautiful smile. Being logical doesn't make you happy? Aina paused, not answering immediately for the first time. Not really. It just makes him happy. Does it make him happy? Or is that just what you think would make him happy? Is there a difference? I know him very well. Aina didn't feel this was refutable. She did know Lionel very well. She even knew exactly how he would react to this exact situation. In fact, she was certain that he wasn't even thinking about her right now. Truthfully, she was very annoyed by this, but she had already decided to be logical. Since she was being logical, how could she be illogically angry? He had already warned her and he was simply following through with what he said he would do. What would being annoyed change? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Unfortunately, it didn't seem that Aina had grasped the ability to differentiate between outward shows of emotion and inward showings. She thought that what someone showed them on the outside was exactly how they felt on the inside. It was a very childish way of viewing the world. She still had the emotional maturity of a toddler. But now that she was feeling this mix of external and internal emotion, she was suddenly confused. Was there a difference between what she thought and the reality? Savon's question left her wondering. Savon. Aina suddenly spoke before Savon could respond. Yes? I have been very, selfish? Yes, selfish to you, right? But you are still here. Is it because you lack backbone? Savon was stunned by these words. She wasn't sure whether she should be angry, sad, or enraged. She managed to calm herself down, but shuddered when she met Aina's gaze again. Was that a bad question? Did it make you angry? I'm sorry. Savon was stunned again. That was the first time Aina had ever apologized since she lost her personality. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Unfortunately, Savon never got the chance to respond. At that moment, the doors opened much more forcefully than they had before. And, this time, it was Richard standing on the other side. Chapter 1175. Richard looked nothing like a man who had just been standing at the scene of a bloody crime. His robes were a deep violet, almost black, embroidered by a deep dark gold color. On his lapel, the symbol of the viola sat, intertwining in flowers and vines, while his tall collars were embroidered with twin-horned dragons. When this sort of outfit was matched with his noble disposition, his cascading black hair and his deep violet eyes, he gave off the feeling of a refined, handsome and confident gentleman. Richard had a light smile on his face, but it froze somewhat when he saw the crying Yuri. He couldn't have something like this ruining his wedding. Judging by the situation, it seems it would be best if the two of you just stayed here. Originally, Richard didn't find there to be any problem with allowing Yuri and Savon to attend. A wife without friends would raise more questions than answers. It was already odd enough that Aina had no family background to speak of. However, if he had to choose between that small oddity and Yuri leaking tears, it was obvious which he would choose. Yuri immediately wanted to protest, but Richard had already snapped his fingers. Several of the maids, one of whom had 6-dimensional strength, came forward. Seeing such a scene, Richard couldn't help but feel a bit of heartache. It was a good thing that the three-pillar galaxy had been at peace for a very long time now, or else the Viola family might very well fall due to this choice of theirs. Losing 20% of their 6-dimensional forces in a single sweep was absolutely unheard of. Even now, Richard could hardly believe it. He was able to ignore the troubling feeling this caused him because he was simply too excited to take Aina as his own. But ultimately, women were just women. One day he would grow bored of Aina and this trouble would come back around full circle. By then, he wouldn't be able to ignore it any longer. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. There was good news, though. They had managed to capture him alive, so they could more easily control Aina in this way. Also, there was definitely something special about Meal and his blood. It was even possible for them to strengthen their lineage factor in the future. Should they succeed, it would all be worth it. It's fine, the area was too closed off. We should be able to keep this a secret for at least a decade. By then, we would have already recovered. Seeing that the maids had come back, Yuri and Savon could only accept their fate in silence. Aina, it's time. Richard's expression softened. Aina nodded and stood. Due to her current stature and the shoes she wore, she was even a small hint taller than Richard now, something that made his lip twitch. But, he buried it deep within. Today was his day, he wouldn't let anything stain it. Hold on a moment. Richard frowned, but Savon continued to speak quickly. It's just a small adjustment. I only want to wish my friend good luck and fortune. Savon appeared before Aina and helped her to fix the last wrinkles of her dress. Do you really want to know? Savon asked. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Aina blinked before remembering what they had been talking about. Then, she nodded. My grandparents died. My parents died. My siblings died. I tolerate the things you've done to me. Because I have no one else. So yes. I guess I am lacking backbone. If I was more like Lionel, maybe things would be easier for me. Aina remained silent for a long while. No one else. Savon let Aina go and returned to the couch to sit by Yuri's side. In silence, Aina walked out of the room with Richard by her side. She shuffled forward in silence, seemingly not hearing the small attempts at conversation that he was making. We will have to wait until after the selection for our honeymoon, but I have amazing things planned. You must not have seen a lot of the dimensional verse yet, right? There are all sorts of extraordinary places. For example, in the Murata sector, there's a world formed entirely of a thick mass of water. Its ice caps have such a dense amount of water force that when it snows, it precipitates force crystals. Every 10,000 years, after enough accumulation, it will enter a blizzard state where the entire planet becomes encased in a thick layer of ice. If you're lucky enough, there's a chance that it could snow pure force crystals. Richard continued to babble on, but when he looked toward Ana's side profile to catch a glimpse of her otherworldly features, he almost snapped. She wasn't paying attention at all. Visit. For a better user experience, Richard had always been good at controlling his emotions, plotting and scheming in the background. But, with the months he spent trying to court Ana, only for her to insult and belittle him at every turn, his patience had long since been wearing thin. He was truly about to snap, but his reason took over once again. Taking deep breaths, he closed his eyes. Soon. It was then that Ana suddenly spoke. You have the smell of my father's blood on you. Richard's gaze flickered. But, he had just calmed himself, he wouldn't lose it again so quickly. Since you know, then there's even less to talk about. Be obedient and he will be fine. Step out of line, and he won't be. It's that simple. You believe that I care for his safety enough to do every and anything you say? Usually such a question would have some sarcasm laced into it, but Ana's tone was indifferent and almost spoken as though she was genuinely asking. Richard's expression couldn't help but change after hearing this. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. My father has always raised me to be a weapon to seek revenge for my mother. Anything that compromises that isn't something that he will accept. Even if he dies, so what? Do you think that this is enough to control me? The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Ana's gaze finally turned toward Richard, but when their eyes met, the latter felt as though his soul had left his body. The cold chill and the scent of death had practically grabbed onto his nose. Ana looked away just as quickly. I am doing this so that I can go to the Void Palace. At the same time, you will receive the social credit of being my husband, not to mention a stake in my future. Don't do unnecessary things and make me look down on you even more. Ana continued to walk forward, her gaze becoming somewhat vacant once more. She still couldn't quite grasp Savon's meaning. But it should have been simple, no? Chapter 1176. Richard stood almost frozen. Had he just lost 20% of his sixth-dimensional experts? For no reason. Ana's mind wandered. This time, she didn't need to hide how she was feeling. It was surprisingly easy for her to separate out emotion and logic when it came to her father. Of course, she lacked the emotional maturity to truly understand why that was. It could have been because her father had always encouraged her to do so. It could be because her father simply didn't mean as much to her as he should have. It could have even been because the weight Lionel held for her was even heavier than that of the man she shared so much blood with. The truth was that with her personality gone, many of the baggage and emotional scarring that came with it had vanished as well. The good news was that this had allowed Ana to heal from many things. Of course, the bad news was how these series of events was playing out. To Ana, she had always attached a lot of this baggage to her father, but most of it wasn't love. It was duty, it was respect, it was an unwillingness to let him down. But on the list of emotions she attached to her father, love was very, very far down the list. When Ana lost her personality, she essentially lost the ability to contextualize her memories. The things that weighed of heavy importance were often things she had the most and fondest memories of. But, with how long it had been since her father left her side, how could she have many of him to begin with? The result was this. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Ana didn't feel worry, sadness or anger. She hadn't even asked how her father was doing or if he would survive the beating they had likely given him. Maybe if Emil could peer into his daughter's mind, he would realize that he had faltered somewhere along their path. As for exactly where, it would be up to him to grasp and understand this. That said, Ana herself was hardly considering this at this moment. As they walked through the Viola estate, following flowery reefs and paths of delicate rose petals, her mind seemed to be somewhere else entirely. no one else. According to Aina's memories, she had felt like Savon had for a very long time. In fact, she had felt it for longer. There was a period in her life before her father returned with Yuri that she was completely ignored. The orphanage system of the Ascension Empire was very good. No children were starved or abused, at least not in the normal way. There was no yelling from their overseers and there was always food on their plates. There were even plenty of opportunities to have fun and live life. Unfortunately, being adopted was something that almost never happened. With the advancements in medicine, sterilization or impotency was practically non-existent. Even in the people that it did, the treatments were fast, affordable and easily administered, as was most healthcare beneath Emperor Fox rule. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, of course, there were still kind-hearted couples, not to mention same-sex couples, who had it within them to help or start families for themselves. But each of these had hurdles of their own. In the case of same-sex couples, the options for surrogacy and sperm donation was so high class that many would choose to have their own children anyway. Surrogacy didn't even need a living human anymore and would only need an egg donor, while the gene analysis exam ensured that any and everything was known about the sperm and egg donors. Then there were the kind-hearted couples, heterosexual or otherwise, who thought to adopt as a good deed to society. The first issue was that the foster care system of the empire was so good, that often the treatment of the children was even better than what these kind-hearted couples could provide, so much of the incentive one might have was not there. Then there came the issue of class disparity. Those on the surface of Earth were often too busy trying to maintain their status into the future generations to worry about adopting, while those on Paradise Islands often lacked the resources to even begin the process. Then there was the biggest and largest issues. The fees that came with adopting a child depending on their gene analysis exam varied wildly. The more talented the child, the more expensive it was, to the point where even many nobles couldn't or refused to afford it. This was done on purpose by Emperor Fox. Children wouldn't understand the underlying system, all they would understand is that their government cared for them since they were children when their parents couldn't and even when no one else wanted them. With her 5-star evaluation, Aina was doomed to never be placed with a family. Every time she made connections with a new friend, they might be adopted the next day, leaving her alone again. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. She closed herself off and focused entirely on her training. She had no one else but herself. Until her father returned with Yuri, giving her a sister and confidant that she had always wanted. But her father didn't spend any time with her, leaving her soon afterward to vanish toward parts unknown. But Yuri never truly treated her like a sister. To Yuri, she was more like a master to serve and cater to. She took care of all of Aina's needs, but it just wasn't the same. Aina knew it wasn't Yuri's fault. Aina was human but Yuri wasn't. The way the latter viewed and interacted with the world was very different. Unfortunately, due to the way Yuri was, Aina ironically felt even more isolated from the world than before, even more alone. The world was repetitive and the same in those days. Rise. Go to school. Study. Train. Eat. Sleep. And repeat. Until, that is, she finally reached the end of the foster care program and was allowed to go to high school along with everyone else. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, it was there she met two people that changed her life. Lionel and Savon. Chapter 1177. Thanks to the live-in dorms of Royal Blue Academy, Aina was finally able to live a life close to normalcy after her 13th birthday. She remembered meeting Savon in her dorm rooms. Back then, Savon had been a really shy and reserved person. She was a lot like Aina, having entered the academy thanks to her talent rather than her family background. For the first time, it was impossible for Yuri to become a wall against Aina meeting other people for the sake of her protection. In addition, because of the environment, she had to tone down a lot of her usual personality, becoming a lot more quiet and reserved. Thanks to this, Aina was able to meet and open up to Savon. Learning that Aina was an orphan, Savon instantly felt more relaxed. Without having to tiptoe around the heiress of some tycoon family or some arrogant princess noble, she was able to slowly open up and become more and more of herself. Not long after Aina met Savon, she met Lionel at their orientation. She honestly didn't remember much about that day at all she could remember was his bright smile. He had his brothers around him and everyone seemed to gravitate toward him. She lost count of how many uppity noble girls cast him one or two extra glances, only to grow frustrated when he didn't seem to notice them back or practically faint when he smiled in return. Aina had thought that he was the son of some famous noble, but she was shocked when she found out that his background was even poorer than Savon's, actually coming from a paradise island. From all the social conditioning she had been through, she had always thought that nobles were too high-strung to ever care for a commoner like Lionel. But he had already been proving them wrong for a very long time. It wasn't until several weeks later their gazes finally met. As much as the first day was a blur, that day was something Aina remembered every moment of. It was as though her entire body had been shocked awake, her hair standing on end and her heart beating wildly. Her blood rushed through her veins and the air flew from her lungs, retreating with no intention of coming back. Lionel must have felt the same thing too, because despite all the girls he had ignored up to that point, despite all the popularity he had gathered, he dashed away from his brothers, appearing before her like a gust of wind. "Will you please be my girlfriend?" The words came out like a clap of thunder. He probably hadn't tried to be so loud, but Aina became like a startled deer in headlights, his booming and confident voice becoming like an avalanche to her ears. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience before she realized what was happening, she, Aina Brazinger, someone who had never been embarrassed or shy a day in her life, rushed off as fast as her legs could carry her. After that day, due to Lionel's popularity, Aina, who had been practically invisible to the young noble girls, had practically become public enemy number one. They couldn't get a glance but she got a confession. What made her worthy? Aina never retaliated to the bullying. She had always tempered her mind and remained calm and calculating. It only seemed to be around Lionel that she completely lost control of her emotions, not knowing what to do with herself or even where to place her hands. However, Savon mistook her calmness for fragility, so she reformed herself, becoming something she was decidedly not. She became Aina's shield, protecting her from the hail of criticism and mean girl tactics of those dorm rooms for an entire 4 years. Since that day, Aina had always had something to lean on. She no longer had no one else. She had a friend willing to become a she-devil to protect her if need be. She had a crush that was willing to wade through hell and high water just for a chance she might say yes. She knew that she didn't need Savon's protection, she could have shut those girls up with a single punch. She knew that she couldn't say yes to Lionel, the weight on her shoulders was far too much and she had to give her goals too much of her focus. And yet, she didn't stop either of them. When Aina and Richard appeared at the beginning of the wedding aisle, it was as though they had become the center of the world. Despite her blank stare forward, Aina was like a fairy, unfettered and unblemished by the mundane. Even if Richard had been a wooden stick, everyone's attention would have been drawn to them. The two slowly walked down the aisle, the blooming of the flower steadily reaching its peak. Aina knew that she had been intoxicated by the feeling. For the first time in her life, she had received the attention, the support, the love she had always wanted. From then on, no matter what she did or how unreasonable she was, they were always by her side, even when she was uncommunicative, even when she blamed them for their weakness. Even when she left them behind. They had always been there. Over the years, she grew dependent on them, addicted to that feeling she had never had as a child, that feeling that should have been given to her by her mother, by her father. Visit. For a better user experience, the pair made their way down under the eyes of all. Richard had his chest proudly out, a confident smile on his features as though what had happened previously never occurred. Soon, such a woman would be his. Then, he would go off to the Void Palace and come back with the tools he needed to lead the Viola family into the 7th dimension and finally end this generation's long war. 10 feet. 8. 5. The flower slowly reached its peak, prepared to allow the world to see its glory. Motes of force gathered around it, filling the air with a sweet and delicate scent. Aina's vacant gaze became somewhat misty, but she didn't seem to notice at all, still blindly moving forward with her mind in other places. But, by now, the two had walked so far forward that the last line of spectators had been crossed. All anyone could see was the alluring view of her back. The facade of Savon had crumbled. Or, more accurately, she had finally told Aina the truth. Over the years, she had grown tired of always being Aina's shield, silently waiting to be picked up when she was needed and dropped off when she wasn't. And now, at this moment, when she was about to get married, she was no longer able to be here. Then there was her father. He was a man who should have been there for her since the very beginning, loving and supporting her. But, he too had failed, captured and likely without a chance to be free for decades to come. Her mother. She had died not long after Aina was old enough to remember her face. And yet now, she could only recall blurry pieces of her visage. She cobbled together pieces that seemed to make sense, but she had no way of even guaranteeing that the woman she remembered was indeed her mother. And then there was Lionel. The love of her life, of them all, this was the only one that made Aina's heart move. It wasn't because it hurt the most. Or maybe it was. But even if it did, this was most definitely not the main reason. Visit. For a better user experience, it was because of them all, whether it was her father, mother, or Savon. All of them weren't here because they couldn't be. Savon was barred by Richard, her mother had passed away, her father was imprisoned. Only he wasn't here by choice. Only he had truly abandoned her. Aina raised her foot to step onto the final platform, but her entire body trembled. The mist of her eyes had turned into something much more than that, but given the vacancy of her gaze, it didn't seem like she had realized this at all. Richard rose his foot as well, beaming at the sight of the flower. It was perfect. His timing was immaculate and his confidence was completely off the charts. He didn't seem to realize at all that Aina's steps had faltered and she had fallen a step behind. Boom. 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 At that moment, the dome of protection over the Viola estate shattered, shocking the spectators awake from their silence. Aina's back trembled. The aura was so familiar. That blinding pillar of light, that hidden air of destruction and menace, that edge of danger and violence. It was so close. She had felt it too many times before, seen it too many times. Even now, with the vacancy of her gaze, she subconsciously grasped out for it, her eyes lighting up from indifferent to expectant. She felt her heart rise out of her chest, her lungs expanding wildly. Her blood rushed beside herself and her paling features were flushed with color in an instant. It was as though she had gone from dead to alive, as though she had finally been given reason to breathe again, to live again. Her head snapped backward, her gaze shooting up into the skies and landing on the figure. The instant she did, it was as though something inside of her had broken, a rush shooting out from her and her eyes flooding with tears she had already barely been holding back. Her whole world collapsed, her mind going blank and her lips moving to say words that were all too familiar. The latest _AP_SODIes are on _the website. You're not him. In the skies, Miguel stood on the back of a golden phoenix, his hands clasped behind his back. Kill. Chapter 1178. Richard's eyes widened. The sudden commotion would have snapped anyone awake, and he, who had been lost in his own world of fantasies, was no different. His head snapped into the skies, his pupils constricting in shock as he watched thousands of Luxniks swoop down from their bird constructs, immediately and without reserve levying attacks toward the guards that reacted from the Viola estate. For a moment, Richard was in a daze. All his plotting and scheming, all his years of training and preparation, could have never made him ready for this day. He couldn't wrap his head around what was happening. Had they already found out about their losses? That was absolutely impossible. Richard had been discreet and as careful as one could be. On top of this, that battle had just ended. How could there possibly have been time to assemble such a contingent? If even that wasn't enough, had this been knowledge the Luxniks used to act upon, the Montecs would have definitely jumped aboard to take advantage as well. Everything pointed toward the fact that the Luxniks had been planning to do this from the very beginning. But Richard truly couldn't understand where their confidence came from. If the Luxniks weren't aware of their 20% loss, then why would they ever take this risk? The three families had always been neck in neck in terms of strength. Launching an attack like this would only cause suffering on both sides and leave the Montecs to benefit from the ashes left behind. What Richard had no way of knowing was that the balance had been broken long ago. In fact, the balance had been broken 3 generations ago, and it had only continued to tip in favor of the Luxniks. Just a single generation ago, they had already had strength to rival both the Montecs and Viola combined. And now, even though this generation had yet to fully mature, they had lost their patience and begun to bare their fangs. Seeth. What is the meaning of this? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the booming voice of the Viola family patriarch boomed. The 6-dimensional existences of the Viola hadn't even had time to catch their breaths and restore their paled faces when they were forced to come out once again. Seeing such a scene, the Luxniks were visibly stunned. They had no idea what could have happened to put the Viola in such a sorry state before the battle had even begun. But, soon afterward, they laughed uproariously. To the arrogant Luxniks, wasn't this just a sign of how correct their ancestor had been? They had patiently waited 3 generations, biding their time and pretending to be equals with this trash. And the day they finally stepped out, ready to bare their fangs, the gods smiled down on them. How could the sharp internal sight of the Luxniks possibly miss something so blatantly obvious? At this point, Richard's face turned several shades of pale. He had been harping so much on the 20% number that he had forgotten something else incredibly important. The 20% loss wasn't nearly as problematic as the current state of the remaining 80%. To say that Meal had killed a fifth of them was only a small part of the story. This didn't consider the at least 20% he had severely injured, or the 20% more than that he had drained of stamina and vigor. If an accurate picture were to be painted, it would be more accurate to say that Meal alone had cut down the fighting prowess of the Viola by as much as 50%. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, seeing such a scene, Miguel was even more affirmed in his decision. He had originally wanted these matters to continue naturally. But, he also understood that naturally didn't mean passively. Miguel wasn't a passive person to begin with. If he insisted on neutrality when allowing things to go on naturally, he would ironically be going against his own nature to begin with. This sort of complicated maze to navigate was precisely why he wanted the fewest people to know of the details of this matter to begin with. He already realized that he was acting differently than he normally would, and that was counterproductive to his goal. To Miguel's mind, there was still only a possibility that the prophecy spoken of on the tablet spoke of a union of marriage between himself and Aina. But, even if it was just a possibility, how could he ever allow a woman who might be tied to himself in the future to be tainted by another? That was the ultimate underlying reason, but this was still a good opportunity nonetheless. In the middle of a wedding, with so many people invited and the guards of the Viola stretched thin, what better time would there be to attack? Plus, the 3-generation waiting period marked down by his ancestor had already passed as well. What else was there to wait for? This, however, was a truly pleasant surprise. It seemed that today, the Viola would truly be finished. Rather than waiting for Seeth to respond, Miguel flipped over a palm and his slender sword appeared. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. Shying. 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 Miguel took a light breath. For a moment, the world lost all of its sound. The only thing those below could hear was the steady inhale and exhale of Miguel's air as time slowed to a crawl. Return to dust. Miguel's arms slowly lowered, and yet it somehow felt impossibly fast. The world was split in two. The clouds separated, the blue skies dimmed to reveal the starry night, and reality itself seemed to pause. The expression of the Viola family patriarch warped. He was an expert on the same level as Seath. No matter how weak he was from the previous battle, there was absolutely no way a pseudo-six-dimensional brat should ever be able to make him feel pressure. And yet, it was already too late. His body crumbled, falling in two before being carried into the wind like fluttering flakes of ash. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, more coming. Chapter 1179. Aina sat blankly on the platform where her wedding was meant to take place. The carnage around her was still ongoing. She could hear the cries of pain and horror and almost feel the rivers of blood tingling the small hairs on her skin, but she was numb to it all. Richard had long since left her side, rushing in an attempt to help the battle. He may have been a lot of things, but a coward wasn't one. And though he was highly intelligent, there was absolutely no way he could have pieced together that the Miguel's goal all along had been to take Aina away, while the destruction of the Viola was just a convenient bonus. So, Richard had left Aina alone, knowing full well that if she faced something she couldn't protect herself from, there was nothing he would have been able to do either way. But there was no doubt that the fate of the Viola had already been sealed. The guests who had come to take part in the wedding but weren't part of the struggle sat in a daze themselves, realizing that they were witnessing the collapse of an empire that had ruled for thousands of years. And yet, just like that, they were finished. Aina, though, couldn't be bothered to care. She didn't pay attention to what was happening, she couldn't hear the voices around her anymore, and she just blankly stared at the violet grass before her. Her tears had long since dried up. The sudden breaking of the dam had snapped her back to reality, a flood of thoughts, emotional compartmentalizations, and slowly grown maturity having come back to her one step at a time. It wasn't an instantaneous process. In fact, it was quite slow at the beginning. The childish thoughts and immaturity seemed to always want to claw their way back. But, a single step at a time, what was, or at least had been Aina, began to return. Visit. For a better user experience, but who was she, anyway? Aina seemed to realize now that something within her had snapped the first day she met Miguel. And, funnily enough, the day it all snapped back into place was the second time she met him. As she sat there, her arms wrapped around her legs and her head buried between her thighs, she felt a pain in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. But, almost like a genius of battle who had finally met her match, this pain wasn't something Aina wanted to run from. Instead, she wanted to bask in it, to feel it fill her nerves and take over her mind. Aina knew she had masochistic tendencies. If it wasn't her ridiculous training regimens, even sometimes going as far as to shatter her own bones just to heal herself, it was always something else. However, this time, she needed this pain not to grow stronger, but to finally feel alive. In these last several months, Aina felt like she had been standing before a tunnel with an exit of blinding white light. She had been trying her hardest, doing everything she could to run in the other direction. But, as though she was stuck in a dream, her legs didn't move as fast as she wanted them to and her movements felt sluggish. She pushed herself harder, only to fall and stumble, failing to claw herself back. Until everything suddenly went black and she returned to this world once more. This pain in her chest right now, the pain she couldn't ignore no matter how hard she tried or how much effort she put in. It was her sign that she was back, that she could finally breathe as herself again, that she could finally be Aina again. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. But it hurt. It hurt like hell. As much as that neutered version of herself wanted to be logical, she knew that wasn't her. She couldn't just bury how she was feeling, and even when she tried, it would always manifest itself in the weirdest of ways. She had too many memories exactly like this. Memories she was often too embarrassed to even recall. Aina took deep breaths, wiping the last evidence of her tears away. She looked up into the skies, almost as though to affirm herself that Lionel was truly not there. For the first time in a long while, she stood to her feet. Her body flashed, her wedding dress falling to ashes and her body being adorned by flexible silver and black armor. She reached for the hairpin that held up her elaborate bun and crushed it in her hands. Then, looking off in a certain direction, she began to walk as though nothing was around her. Surprisingly, or maybe not very much so, no one bothered her. To the Viola, she was their crown heir's soon-to-be wife. And, to the Luxniks, she was on the list of those they weren't meant to touch. Using her high blood force affinity, finding her father's direction was as easy as breathing. Though Miguel took note of Aina's actions, he also did nothing to stop her. If Aina believed that they hadn't come for her, that was fine too. He didn't mind. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, she was indeed as beautiful as the piece of her face he had seen before told him, but most beautiful woman he had ever seen, but Miguel's pride wasn't something most could understand. He wouldn't chase a woman, even if he wanted her. How things fell into place in the future, so long as he was the light mentioned, he didn't care. His goal wasn't women, nor was it fame or wealth. It was to stand at the pinnacle of the dimensional verse, and he didn't care who he needed to use to get there. The events of that day would spread like wildfire, setting the sector ablaze and leaving a shocking amount of territory completely unprotected. But, what did these matters have to do with the Void Palace? Without even a slight delay in schedule, the second day would begin on the day it was promised. In the skies above, Eleanor watched this scene with her arms crossed about her chest, coldly watching Aina's every action before she lightly snorted. Consider yourselves lucky. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. She seemed to be referring to the Viola, as though their collapse wasn't punishment enough or like she had had something even worse in store for them. But, her next words were even more unabashedly wild. And you. Even if my son doesn't want you anymore, you'll still have to spend the rest of your life single. Chapter 1180. Aina walked slowly, her father draped over her back. Despite the weight of the man, with Aina's obscene strength, doing this much wasn't very much trouble at all. In fact, had she wanted to, there were probably a myriad of ways she could carry her father without even touching him. But, in the end, she still chose this method. Despite the grief her father had brought her in her lifetime, he was still her father. While he could be considered to be emotionally abusive, Aina could still understand where he came from. At the same time, if she fell into some introspection, what exactly was the alternative? One of the few guilty pleasures Aina had was reading and watching dramas. When she wasn't studying, training, eating or recovering, she lost herself in worlds that weren't her own. But, in how many of those stories was the trouble the heroine faced the exact opposite of her own? In a father-daughter dynamic, would Aina even get the chance to do things as she pleased? Wasn't it more likely that her father would try to protect and coddle her, closing her off to the world because she was simply too fragile as a woman? It sounded quite ironic to say such things now because of how many mental breakdowns Aina had had in recent months. But, after regaining control of her faculties, she could say with 100% certainty that she would choose a father like this 10 out of 10 times over a father who refused to let her chase after her goals and live life. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Had her father made mistakes? Yes. Had his approach been terrible? Yes. Could he have picked a path that would make a lot of this much easier on himself and everyone else? Yes. However, he was still a man willing to hand over the Brazinger family heirloom to a little girl, even knowing that it would cripple his own strength. He was still a man willing to leave her on the safety of Earth to slowly grow while he weathered the storm of the world alone to pave a path for her to be here. He was still a man willing to face the army of a pillar family alone, all while poisoned and handicapped, just so that she wouldn't have to do something she hadn't wanted to do. He wasn't a perfect father by any stretch. But, what in her life was perfect to begin with? This father of hers was the only family she had left, the one unconditional pillar of support. She wouldn't allow any more harm to come to him. Miel's body was too weak to move. Being forced to rest on his daughter's back like this, the rest of his body refusing to listen to his commands, when it should have been him protecting her. He felt a seething rage boil all through him, his flaming red hair and crimson eyes practically jumping about as though they had minds of their own. He felt a wild mix of emotions he couldn't even properly process. But again and again, shame, humiliation and inadequacy popped up in a perpetual cycle, refusing to allow him to forget. I'm sorry. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Meal's hoarse voice barely came out audibly. His vocal cords had been shredded and he barely managed to squeeze out these words before he hacked up a mouthful of blood and organs. The poison that Richard had forced on him wasn't lethal to begin with, but it would still take another day before it was flushed out of his system completely. That, compounded by his injuries, made him extraordinarily weak. If not for the Viola needing him for whatever reason, he would have long since died in battle. Anna's steps froze when she heard her father's words. She wasn't quite sure how to react. This wasn't the first time her father had said such a thing to her. In fact, this was precisely the second time. The first time was when she had just lost her mother and her father was forced to leave soon afterward. That was maybe the lowest point in Meal's life. His wife died, his daughter was cursed, and he was useless to stop it all. He could barely stop himself from breaking down in front of his little girl. And now, over a decade later, little else had changed. He was still here, still too weak to do anything, still apologizing to his little girl. Visit. For a better_user experience, his mistakes were always compounded. Every step he took forward, he cost those closest to him even more. If he had never allowed his love to grow and bloom, that beautiful woman he had loved with all his heart would still be alive. If he hadn't let his emotions dictate his actions, the gorgeous little baby girl they had birthed together wouldn't have to live a life of suffering. If he hadn't been too confident in his strength and spent more time refining his mind, he would have never let his daughter come so close to giving up the most precious moment of her life to a man who didn't deserve it. He tried to teach his daughter to become a better him, a greater version of himself. But he never realized that he was so broken and damaged himself that whatever he projected to his little girl would be broken and damaged as well. He truly didn't know how he would face his daughter ever again, but for her to come out unscathed due to nothing more than trash luck. He didn't know how he should feel. This was the only thing he could do. Apologize. He was useless. It was the only thing he had left to give. Anna didn't know how to respond. For a very long time, she just stood frozen in place, unmoving and in a daze. Compared to when she had been a toddler hearing those words, it hit much differently now that she was a grown woman. Visit. For a better_user experience, when she finally did open her mouth to respond, what she said was short and simple. But it was still enough that Meal could no longer hold back his tears. Everything that he hadn't shed for his wife, for leaving his daughter behind, for her growing without him by her side, for all the failures he had had in this life. It all poured outward like an endless torrent, a silent stream of tears drenching his daughter's back. I love you, Dad. Chapter 1181. Lionel woke up and stretched. With light steps, he hopped out of bed and began his revamped flexibility routine. This version was much less embarrassing than the former, but Lionel still preferred to do it alone. The Luxniks were natural healers, so the techniques they had in this regard were extensive and well thought out. Compared to the techniques of Valiant Heart Mountain, they were by far and away better. They couldn't even be considered to be in the same league. Lionel wanted to focus on not just flexibility, but power in his flexibility. The importance of that would be his ability to apply strength in positions most could not. For example, in a deep squat where one's bottom nearly touched the ground. Most couldn't even get into such a position to begin with, at least not without their heels coming off of the ground. But, even those that could reach such a position, how much weight could they push? Depending on the depth of a squat, the max weight that could be pushed varied along a predictable slope. What Lionel wanted to was eliminate this weakness as much as he could, and to do so with every similar type of movement as well. To perfectly fuse flexibility and power, that was his ultimate goal, and he was well on his way. Lionel jumped to his feet and felt like a spring was coiled within his body. His joints felt good, his ligaments and tendons felt smooth, and his muscles felt explosive. Better yet, his mind was in its prime. Every breath of air felt fresh and beautiful. Time to go. Lionel slipped on a pair of sweatpants and a crisp t-shirt. He no longer bothered with shoes these days as his body was already stronger than any shoe sole to begin with. On top of that, using his own 2 feet not only made him more sensitive to certain changes, but Lionel also felt more flexible in his movements. He smiled lightly to himself, running his fingers through his pale violet hair. Today should be fun. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. The young geniuses of Earth, though they had mostly failed in the first day, still came out to support in full force during the second day. Not only were they here in solidarity, but they also wanted to see the true extent of prowess the geniuses of the sector had to offer. Like this, they would know exactly how much further they had to go. The boys seemed intent on watching Lionel from time to time, almost as if to check if he was truly okay. None of them knew what happened at the Viola estate a few days prior, but they believed that Aina had likely gotten married. Still, Lionel continued to act the same way he always had. He laughed and joked with the others as though this matter truly had nothing to do with him. This allowed them and Lionel's grandmother to sigh a breath of relief. There were many people who would bloviate and draw a line on their self-worth. But, when push came to shove, they would still allow others to steamroll over them. At least for now, it seemed that Lionel had not regretted his decision and could still function happily. What they didn't notice, though, was that Lionel had raised an internal eyebrow upward. Due to his plan to deal with Aina's father, Lionel had split much of his attention to focus on the arena and its people. He not only needed to locate him, but he also needed to find the opportune moment to act. Miel hadn't been among the Viola family members previously, so Lionel was effectively scanning the whole arena for someone who should match his description. Lionel was certain that he would have red hair and eyes. In addition, he should have an energy signature similar to that of the other Brazingers he had met. But, what Lionel didn't expect was the oddity of the arena. For one, there were far too many people on high alert as though they were waiting for the other foot to drop. They were either whispering amongst themselves, looking toward the entrances, or even muttering to themselves. Secondly, the Montex family region seemed to have several individuals walking on pins and needles. Many of them had nervous or fidgeting expressions that only calmed after they reached the arena. But, even then, the elders all seemed to have heavy looks on their faces. And lastly, the Viola family region which should have been filled to the brim was decidedly empty. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel narrowed his eyes. It couldn't have been more obvious to him that something big had happened. There was no way that the Viola would miss such an opportunity. And, considering the relaxed air and smiles around the Luxnix family, he had a guess as to what might have happened as well. A grand event like a wedding is indeed a good chance to catch a family of such great stature off guard. The Luxnix have been biding their time for 3 generations, so maybe they thought this was the perfect opportunity. But what does this mean for Aina's father? He was their vassal, so he probably had to fight as well. If he died, did the tablet fall into the hands of the Luxnix? This was possible, probable, even. If it was true, it would make things a lot more complicated. Rather than defeating one person, he would have to deal with a whole family, all while trying to outpace what growth they'd have with a tablet. That would be a tall mountain to climb. Lionel had hardly finished this thought when his internal sight flickered once more. His brows couldn't help but furrow in slight confusion. Aina, Savon, Yuri and Miel were right there, seated together along with the commoner ranks. The only difference was that all 4 were wearing masks. Did they manage to escape? Never mind, this is a good tea, Lionel's pupils constricted. Aina, who had been focused on the arena, her hands gripped together, suddenly snapped her head in the direction of Earth's people. Lionel's back was facing her as he didn't need to look with his eyes to use his internal sight. But, that didn't stop her from doing so at all. She, sensed my internal sight? Lionel didn't get a chance to process this before Orinik flickered and appeared. He clearly had no intention of waiting for the Viola. The rules have already been explained. Day 2 will be a round-robin style tournament. Your performance will be vetted to decide upon the 3rd and final day. The billboard will decide your groups. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The flickering of the board began. There were only 300 individuals who made it past the first day, and each round-robin group would have 20 individuals. It also seemed that due to the fact these groups were smaller this time, all 15 groups would be going at the same time. Lionel looked up to spot his number, only for his eyes to narrow even further. Though there were no names, Lionel's memory was simply too good. Of the 300 participating, he knew the numbers of them all. Even if he didn't, he could recognize the energy signature of the force that made up their numbers. In his group: 1. Lionel Morales 2, Higlas Montec 7, Isaac Arundo 13, Richard Viola 17, Siller Lux Nix. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. 20. Aina Brazinger. Chapter 1182. Lionel didn't spend very long looking at the billboard of motes of light. As easily as he had memorized the numbers of everyone, he had also memorized his own group just as quickly. Instead, his mind was still spinning. Before lifting her curse, Aina's mind was the weakest part of her by far. After she accidentally absorbed his blood during a particularly rough session, they stumbled upon a cure for her curse. Back then, Aina had chosen to keep a small piece of her curse with her because it was useful for her training. But by then, everything was already perfectly under control. Lionel remembered that her mental coercion was so powerful back then that it not only affected him, but she found it difficult to control as well. With such powerful suggestion, even if Aina had been an ugly woman, there would have been lines of men wrapping around several planets waiting to do her bidding. When such mental coercion was fused with her top-tier genetics, well, the results spoke for themselves. It was actually thanks to Aina that Lionel grasped how to use his king's might so quickly. That sort of coercive ability on the world was something that he had gotten a front-row seat to every day until Aina finally learned how to control it. But, even then, the change hadn't been to the point where Aina had overtaken Lionel in matters of the mind. After all, Lionel was at the peak of the fifth dimension in these matters. In fact, he was more accurately at a pseudo-sixth-dimensional state thanks to awakening his wisdom branch so early. For Aina to be able to sense his internal sight so easily. In order to remain as stealthy as possible, Lionel had chosen to strip his internal sight of much of its strength. The reason why he could only tell that people were whispering amongst themselves and muttering, but he couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, was because he had stripped his internal sight of that ability to make it less obvious. And yet, she had still sensed it. Of course, now Aina was well into the fifth dimension, the gap between his mind and hers then, versus it now was much smaller. But still. Visit. For a better user experience, this makes things more complicated, but it isn't impossible. She reacted, but her father didn't. That means that her mental coercion and strong mind aren't a shared strength of their lineage factor, so it's still possible. In that case, isn't there a perfect opportunity? I'll just wait until she's fighting a battle to make a move, Aina. Is something wrong? Savon's voice snapped Aina awake. No, it's nothing. I hope my group isn't too hard, Savon laughed self-deprecatingly. They really made it hard with these numbers. I have no way of knowing who I'm matching up against. Aina smiled. You're very strong. I think you'll do great. Aina didn't need to lie, Savon was, indeed, very powerful. Though far weaker than herself, Savon was still a talent of Earth. After so long on a sixth-dimensional world, the amount of potential she had unearthed was astounding. Plus, Savon had a great amount of battle prowess because she had already become used to surviving on her own. Aina was very confident in her friend. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The billboard flickered once more. This time, choosing the first set of matches. A total of 30 numbers lit up, preparing the crowd for 15 matches at once. Oh. Seems like it's my turn already. Lionel thought to himself. I'll be back, he said with a smile. Lionel's flickered, a small circle of dust being left where he once stood. When he appeared again, he was already on the stage. Bang! The stage before Lionel quaked, a heavy-set young man landing before him. The stone threatened to crack, and it took several moments before the stage itself ceased to move. Anyone else might have directly fallen from the impact, but Lionel's body simply swayed from side to side as though an expertly engineered creation unmoved by natural disasters. Bang! Bang! The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. A twin pair of aces slammed against the ground, the low growl of the young man matching the sudden eruption of cheers. He had entered a state of battle the moment he landed. Like many others, he saw this as an opportunity of a lifetime, one that he had no intention of squandering. He would make sure he squeezed everything he had out of his body. He wasn't from a family like the Montecs, Viola, or Luxniks. He wasn't even from a family a step below them like the Sage or the Arundo. However, he had still managed to claw his way here to the second day, and he would make his every breath count. Seeing Lionel's nonchalance, he couldn't help but be disgusted, but it didn't take him off his focus in the slightest. In fact, it only made him more focused, his force rising up like a tide, steadily flooding throughout his body and crashing against the barriers he himself put up. He rose up his twin maces, unleashing a mighty roar into the skies before exploding forth. Bang! Lionel didn't seem to notice the movement of the young heavy-set man before him. Instead, his head tilted to the side slowly, feeling a strong aura to his left. Miguel stood in abject silence, his eyes closed and his long hair fluttering in the wind. He seemed completely separate from everything around him, displaced from the world and higher than even the skies above their head. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel smiled. No, it might very well be more accurate to say that he grinned. The way his head tilted, the way his hands rested in his pockets, even down to the way the dancing wind pressed his clothing to his toned torso and how the shadows outlined his handsome features. It seemed that even with Miguel's disregard and calm, Lionel was a demon that had found his prey. Last chapter for today. Chapter 1183. Hug-Hawk charged forward like a raging bull. The air formed a semi-spherical curtain around him, his speed and mass so disproportionate that sparks flew in the air. To his back, his maces followed, sparking as they clashed with the wind. In the blink of an eye, he appeared before Lionel, his shoulders swinging as though it was nothing more than a lever. The flexibility was obscene and the power behind it was even more so. At that moment, Lionel's gaze shifted from Miguel back to Hug-Hawk. His gaze was frighteningly cold and his body was completely unmoving. However, if one ignored the commotion around him and paid attention to the ground beneath his feet, it would be possible to see his toes hooking downward with such force that 10 holes surrounded by spiderweb thin cracks had appeared. The deepest and most important things to Lionel were respect and persistence. Even if he felt his opponent was far weaker than him, he would give them their due respect. Miguel was one matter, a matter he would deal with in due time. However, Hug-Hawk was a different matter entirely. Lionel's entire demeanor changed in a matter of a fraction of a moment. The last 3 meters between himself and Hug-Hawk happened within the blink of an eye to everyone else. But, to him, everything had slowed so considerably that he could see the fierce twinkling light in his opponent's eyes, he could see the sizzling heat of the swinging mace as it scorched through the atmosphere as though a falling meteor, and he could see the steady drum of determination that reverberated through Hug-Hawk's heart. The mace appeared right above Lionel's head, its leading spike barely half a foot from connecting. It was then that Lionel moved. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. His right foot swiveled backward in a quarter circle, shifting his body to the side and allowing the mace to whiz right by him. The harsh whistling was so grating on the ears that a lesser person with a weaker body might have felt their ears burst. But Lionel had already reacted. His anchor foot remained down, his right foot moving again and lifting into the air, stepping down with a vicious momentum. The descent of Lionel's soul made the previous meteoric assault of Hug-Hawk's mace seem like nothing more than child's play. There was something about the timing of Lionel's movements that felt incomparably smooth, something about the ease and conservation of energy that seemed especially beautiful. He was like a well-oiled machine, using only as much as he needed and nothing more. Bang! The polearm of the mace met Lionel's stomp. The instance was so perfectly timed that the mace had just crashed into the stage's stone platform. The result was Lionel's strength fusing with Hugok's own, causing the latter's expression to change. Hugok felt his wrist nearly break, the skin of his fingers and palms suddenly experiencing so much pressure that they ripped free from his muscle and bone, sending a shocking pain to his brain so severe that he froze for just a moment. The result was him missing a counter opportunity with his second mace even as he lost his grip on the first, his hand turning into a bloody mess. Bang! Visit. For a better user experience, the stage imploded, a cloud of dust, rock and bits of stone rising into the air. But that only hid the muffled bang that happened an instant afterward. The crowd was stunned to find Hugok's body flying out faster than it had come rampaging in. He shot out of the plume of debris so quickly that it became immediately obvious that he had lost consciousness. The steel metal plate he wore on his chest was completely crumpled, a hole the size of a fist becoming its new centerpiece. Hugok crashed outside of the arena, his mouth violently erupting with a pillar of blood. There was no doubt who had won the battle. But by this point, Miguel was already stepping off of his stage, his opponent standing frozen in place. For a long while, the young woman didn't move, her expression staring out into blank space. Moxie. It was unknown who had called out this name, but it became like a trigger for a chain reaction. The young woman's body crumbled piece by piece, her expression becoming one of helplessness and sadness in her final moments. It felt as though she wanted to ask, "Why did you have to kill me?" But, whether because she didn't have the strength to do so, or realized there wasn't much of a point, she reserved the last of her strength to die with dignity. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. Her face wilted and collapsed into a pile of ash, fluttering into the wind. Lionel watched this with silence. He too could have killed his opponent easily. It was only a matter of using a little bit more force or a slight manipulation of his force. He hadn't done so because he didn't see the point. When he fought large groups of people, killing as a deterrent and to ensure the safety of his life was one matter. He had learned to accept that this was necessary and began to live with the result. However, in a one-on-one battle where there were no variables to account for outside of the man right before him, not to mention the fact they didn't have a grudge, he couldn't help but think. Why? Were lives really so worthless? Did they not mean anything? Even if they couldn't defeat you, couldn't they have still fought for their dreams against others? And even if they couldn't, so what? Were they worthless because they happened to be born with less talent than others? Because they happened to have weaker backers? Because luck hadn't shined down on them the same way? Who could make such decisions? Who had the right to be the arbitrator of who lived and who died? Is this what you've been doing with my power? Lionel's voice seemed to carry a mysterious strength with it, so much so that there wasn't a single person who couldn't hear it. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, in that case I'll be sure to take it back. Trash like you is unworthy of having it. Miguel's steps froze. Chapter 1184. Published at 2nd of September 2022 5:05 and 18 seconds AM. Chapter 1184. Said nothing. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1184. Said nothing. Miguel's head turned, his golden gaze meeting Lionel's pale violet irises. For a moment, the world turned still, a hollow clash reverberating before what sounded like the roar of dragons and the cry of phoenixes resonated through the air. Though, it was difficult to tell if this was truly what was happening, or if it was simply an illusion created by the thumping hearts of those spectating. It felt as though the other still ongoing battles were meaningless, as though what remained of the selection had suddenly become a poor attempt at extending vacant, vacuous entertainment when the true root of what they wanted to see was already right before them. Lionel might have still stood on his stage while Miguel had already stepped down from his own. And yet, their gazes still somehow felt level. A thick violet aura hung around Lionel, a dense golden fog hanging around Miguel. The trembling of planet Luxnix itself seemed to shock people awake from their stupor, their grips on the armrests of their chairs and the erratic beating of their arms suddenly jumping forward several levels in strength. Then, it all vanished at once. The two looked away almost simultaneously, Lionel stepping down from his stage and walking toward Earth's geniuses while Miguel walked toward the Luxniks. At their closest, their shoulders practically brushed against one another. But, by their reactions, one would have never guessed such a thing. If one had been entirely focused on their expressions, they might as well have been worlds away from one another. The elders of the Luxniks watched on with narrowed gazes. None of them understood the nuance of Lionel's views. Many of them believed that Lionel would have targeted Miguel one way or another. And now, they felt that their guesses had only been affirmed. Even to this point, they didn't have a firm understanding of Lionel's strength. And, truth be told, they had no idea that Lionel had already regrown his innate node. If regrowing innate nodes was so easy, why would stealing them be such a large deal? If the matter was so simple, those with innate nodes would probably be reared like farm animals, being harvested every so often. Unfortunately, Lionel's lack of understanding when it came to the dimensional verse was rearing its ugly head once again. If news that his father could regrow innate nodes came out, who knew what kind of commotion it would cause? To the current Lionel, he assumed that it was possible, it was just that it took a lot of time. After all, it took him 20+ years of drinking that vomit smoothie to instigate the regrowth of his innate node. To him, it was just a tedious process. The truth of the matter was that Lionel's father had joined the government of the Ascension Empire, entering their research branches, to personally create a method of healing his son by fusing his knowledge of the dimensional verse with Earth's brand of technology. It could only be said that Lionel's father was a genius that appeared once in several hundred generations. It was unknown if even Lionel could ever reach the level his father had. This was how exaggerated this matter was. Of course, even Velasco miscalculated sometimes. How could he think that his son would be so reckless as to try to form a 10th node? According to Velasco's original intention, upon breaking into the 6th dimension using the God Path, Lionel's innate node would naturally begin to regrow itself. But, it had appeared in the 3rd dimension, far too early. This aside, the residual Scarlet Star force that had leaked from Lionel during his breakthrough into Tier 3 was explained away by the elders with a myriad of different hypotheses. This went to show just how far the idea of regrowing an innate node was from their minds. Now that they heard Lionel's words, they all believed that Lionel wanted to take his innate node back, something that left their brows furrowed and their gazes cold. But, when they realized that Lionel had just antagonized Miguel when the latter had cared little for him before, and how Lionel was merely at Tier 3 while Miguel could step into the 6th dimension whenever he wanted, they relaxed their murderous intentions. There was no need to antagonize the Void Palace when this matter would be easily dealt with by Miguel. Lionel returned to sit by his grandmother's side with a smile on his face. It was as though what had happened previously hadn't occurred at all. Little Leo, you need to be careful. Scarlet Star Force is very dangerous. It's one of the only forces I know that can cause damage to higher dimensional beings even in a lower dimensional state. And if it's at the same level. I don't know if there's a defense that can stop it if it's not constructed by a force on the same or near the same level. Lionel blinked. You don't have to worry, grandmother. I know. I actually don't feel much danger from him at all. If anything, Aina is stronger than him. Rija's brow furrowed. Her senses were sharper than Lionel's and her internal sight was far stronger. She was absolutely certain that Miguel was still stronger than Aina was. So, why would he say something so reckless? Her grandson didn't seem like the type to mindlessly boast. She opened her mouth to say something else, but in the end she just sighed. She was still only just beginning to form her relationship with Lionel. She felt like she was walking on eggshells not because she was scared of her grandson, but because she was afraid to say something that overstepped her bounds. She shook her head and made a decision. If Lionel was really in danger fighting Miguel, even if it meant offending the Void Palace, she would still move. She would rather lose her life than allow any harm to come to her grandson. The battles raged on and Arnold and Milan eventually got their turns. As one might expect, they didn't perform astoundingly, but they didn't perform poorly either, each winning about 30 to 40% of their matchups. Since performance was based on evaluations and not raw numbers during the second day, they might get a pass due to their low strength. Of course, Elther, Careless, and Noah performed even better than this. Soon, it was Aina's turn to step onto the arena once again. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Let's hope this works. Numerous small crystalline spiders formed on his palm. Roja raised an eyebrow, but said nothing in the end. Chapter 1185. Published at 2nd of September 2022 5:05 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1185. Fan clubs. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1185. Fan clubs. Despite wearing a mask, Aina seemed to have become the center of attention once more. Though, this time, this only seemed to be in one portion due to her beauty. While her face might have been covered, there was simply no mistaking that enormous axe and figure that seemed to attract so many gazes like a magnet. It didn't take much time at all for Aina's own fan club to come out in full swing, their loud cheers rocking the stadium. In truth, several such fan clubs had crept up. Even Elther had his own. Though, maybe this wasn't so surprising since he did the devilish handsome archetype wonders. His horns only made him feel more exotic and made even more women swoon. Among the fan clubs, though, Aina's and Miguel's could be said to be the largest. Elther was more like a niche specific to a certain population of unabashed degenerates and furries. As for Lionel, he was probably a close second to Aina and Miguel. Lionel never really considered it before because he had spent his whole life, practically, chasing after just a single woman, but he was quite handsome in his own right. Unfortunately, his style of dress docked him a few points, and his unknown background docked him a few more. If Lionel dressed in expertly tailored robes like Miguel and the other geniuses did, not to mention making his Morales family origins public information, he would probably speed by the ladder with ease. But, he was quite comfortable where he was at. Unless it was a cool uniform, he wouldn't compromise his own comfort to wear it. How ridiculous. Funny enough, Aina got the opposite reception. Though Aina and Lionel were opposites in a lot of respects, when it came to their casual form of dress, they were in complete lockstep. Aina put functionality over everything else, and Lionel placed his comfort above everything else. Something like fashion wasn't at the forefront of either of their minds. But, because Lionel was a man, his style was seen as lazy as opposed to Aina, who just received a more exotic label that made her stand out from other girls. Her armor not only covered her from head to toe, something so shocking to see on a woman that it was practically its own fallacy, but every piece of it had its own purpose. Aina's fan club couldn't help but praise her modesty, and she cared more about her battle prowess than how good she looked. Of course, there was one other reason Aina's fan club was so passionate. They had all learned that she was still single and hadn't gotten married. The women were excited for her, weaving stories about how she had been forced into her circumstances even without knowing the truth. Of course, Miguel became involved in these fanciful tales, becoming the Prince Charming that saved the princess from her shackles like a gentleman should. As for the men, they felt like there was still a chance for them, furiously rebutting the lovesick tales of the women. The ultimate result were deafening cheers, clapping hands and stomping feet that threatened to bring the whole arena down. Lionel, though, was completely unlike everyone else. The moment Aina had moved, he had become completely focused on his task, the small little crystalline spiders on his palm springing into action. Lionel followed them as they rushed through the arena, his mind completely focused. It would take a large expenditure to have them run so far from him, especially due to their small size. But, he had no other choice in the matter. He couldn't afford to use any other means because it might very well alert others. If there were spatial fluctuations and it was picked up by the members of the Void Palace, they might assume the worst and think Lionel to be cheating. Though it would be quite obvious after an investigation that he wasn't, he preferred to not have to deal with such a difficulty at all. From start to end, Lionel didn't really think about the morality of what he was doing, mostly because he didn't believe that there was anything wrong with it. The only way one could see something wrong was if he had a relationship with Aina's father in some way, but considering that Lionel had accepted that he and Aina would never be together, he didn't see things like that at all. As far as Lionel was concerned, Aina's father was no different from a stranger to him. Now, an argument could be made that it was unethical to steal something from someone who hadn't done you any wrong, and that was a fair point. But this was a hit on his own morality that Lionel was willing to take. There were certain tough decisions that Lionel knew he would have to make if he wanted to reach his goals. When he chose to resurrect Elther instead of his closest friend in those years, Rollin, he had already made one such sacrifice. And he knew well that there would be many others he would have to make. The spiders scurried through the arena. Lionel knew that he was on a time crunch. Aina wasn't fighting a person she would have to try very hard against. It would likely only last a single exchange. However, he had timed things well. He began moving the instant Aina's name blinked. With everything being within his calculations, he should make it. The spiders cut the distance. 100 meters. 50 meters. 20 meters. The gap closed rapidly, Lionel's expression turning a bit pale. The distance between them was at least a kilometer to begin with. But, with the size of the spiders, it felt like 100 times that. We made it. Aina's battle was already over, another resounding victory for her. She made her way back quickly, but it was already too late. The spiders closed down the last meter distance between them and Meal, ready to pounce onto his spatial ring and fuse with it. However, right at that moment, something Lionel had never expected occurred. Yuri snapped her head in the direction of the spiders, her gaze glowing with a dangerous light. Before Lionel could react, a vast pressure descended, shattering the 3 spiders into motes of light. Lionel slowly opened his eyes, his expression somewhat pale and his pupils constricted. What was that? Chapter 1186. Published at 2nd of September 2022 5:05 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 1186. Line of thought: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1186. Line of thought. Lionel took a deep breath, surging tides of force coming in from all directions to replenish his stamina. Thanks to his stars, even though Lionel couldn't make use of the golden-scaled koi fish without breaking the rules, Lionel's personal ability to replenish stamina was exceptional. It would at most take him a few dozen minutes to fully recover. Still, his mind was wandering elsewhere as the battles raged on. He hadn't expected that after he circumvented the problem of Aina, that he would run into another stone wall. The problem of the spiders being destroyed wasn't actually much of an issue. They were just beast constructs, their death wouldn't harm Lionel in any way. But, in that moment, Lionel's own internal strength had almost been harmed. Had he not been fast enough, not only would Yuri's internal sight have damaged his own, but she would have also been able to trace those spiders back to him. Lionel's brow couldn't help but furrow before he leaned back and sighed. The dimensional verse was much larger than he gave it credit for. Even after so many years, it was still giving him surprises. He had originally thought that no one would be able to match his internal sight, especially after he matched his innate talent with the manipulation techniques of the Luxniks. But now, he had been slapped in the face not just once thanks to Aina, but twice thanks to Yuri. As time went on, the advantage that Lionel had gained from his wisdom branch's first awakening would only become less and less obvious. He had originally been leaps and bounds beyond anyone else, having fifth-dimensional boundaries in the third dimension. But now, everyone was in the fifth dimension. He couldn't expect to continue with the same advantages. Or he would have to forge new advantages for himself. I need to step into the third awakening of the wisdom branch soon, Lionel thought to himself. This was the first time Lionel actively wanted his Luxnik's lineage factor to progress faster. In the past, it had always come naturally. But after these events, he realized that maybe just his own talent wasn't enough anymore. As for the matters with Yuri, after calming himself from the initial shock, Lionel wasn't too surprised. Aina had never told him about Yuri's past, but she had told him that she wasn't human. In addition, he knew that Yuri's telekinesis ability, the very same ability Raylion had, wasn't actually an ability at all. Rather, it was the innate skill of her race of people. Lionel didn't know whether Aina didn't want to tell him what race Yuri was a part of, or if she simply didn't know, but the truth didn't matter. It was likely just another example of her not trusting him while he entrusted everything to her. Regardless, he was no longer emotional about it. All that mattered was that Yuri was maybe even more troublesome than Aina in this regard thanks to her origins. And, now that he had failed once, they would all be on guard. Yuri? What's wrong? Emil frowned, wincing slightly. His injuries still hadn't fully healed, but he had insisted on being here. How could he miss such a thing? You unleashed a lot more of your power than you normally do. I told you to be careful with that. Until you make it to the Void Palace, you can't let others know of your origins. And even then, you have to be careful with who you can trust. Originally, Emil was going to send Yuri to the Void Palace along with Aina as a maid-servant. With how many noble men and women were allowed entry, some were given exceptions to bring along one person in such a capacity. But, now that the quotas had expanded, Yuri could enter on her own, making things a lot easier. I know, adoptive father. But, someone just targeted you. Yuri's frown deepened. Her adoptive father had always made her keep a very low profile for her own safety. A large part of the reason she felt so broken up about Aina's wedding was because she felt she was being forced to choose between her own safety and her sister's happiness. That was right. Yuri felt like she could have saved Aina that day. Whether that was because of an overinflated sense of confidence or reality. Maybe only she and Emil knew the answer to that. Targeted me? Yuri sighed. It wasn't that Emil's mind was weaker than them, it was rather that using the Brazinger family lineage factor placed a lot of strain on the mind. After going all out just a day before, Emil's soul force was fragmented and injured. How could he sense the danger as easily? Yes. They were 3 beast constructs. I tried to track the person, but they retreated too quickly. But, from what it looks like, it's the Luxnix family technique. Emil's brow raised before he sighed. Nothing in this world comes for free. Yuri felt deflated. The Luxnix had swooped in and saved Aina that day, but they hadn't asked for anything in return. Originally, she had held the hope that maybe this was because Aina was never the target and that the wedding was just a good chance to deal with the Viola, but this attempt seemed to spit in the face of that. Could their goal have been more complex than the fall of the Viola? Emil's line of thinking was the same, but he still didn't conclude that these matters were related to Aina. Would a large family war with another just for the sake of a single girl? Though his daughter was exceptionally talented, weren't all these families arrogant? Plus, they had Miguel, a child even Emil himself was greatly impressed by. On top of this, they couldn't have known that he would be able to weaken the Viola so much before they fought. So, Emil's thoughts were very, very different. Could it be that they learned of the existence of the bronze tablet? Could that be the true reason they attacked the Viola? A hint of worry marred Emil's brow. If his greatest secret was exposed. This could be troublesome. On the other side of the arena, Lionel, who had long since calmed, began to deduce several things. Among them was the exact thought process of the current Emil and Yuri. Yes, if they believe him from the Luxnix family, that would indeed be their line of thinking. Maybe I can use this to my advantage. Lionel looked up, feeling a familiar aura calling out to him. It seemed that it was his turn to battle once again. Lionel Morales versus Siller Luxnix. Chapter 1187. Published at 2nd of September 2022 5:05 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1187. Man of Energy. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1187. Man of Energy. Siller was like a spark of lightning. Among the Luxnix, he was probably one of the only few that cut his hair short, and it made him look like a 16 or 17-year-old kid, far younger than he truly was. He appeared on the platform eager to go. But, when he saw that his opponent was actually Lionel, his brows couldn't help but shoot up. Lionel himself landed on the platform about a minute after Siller, not having gone all out to reach the stage like his opponent had. However, he greeted the latter with a smile that took him completely off guard. Siller was certain that with Lionel's hatred of the Luxniks, a smile would be the last thing he would find. In fact, he was quite certain that he would find exactly the opposite of that. But, to think that Lionel would be looking at him like this. The truth was that Siller, along with many of the most recent generation, were fairly in the dark about the truth of these matters. That said, they weren't completely clueless, mostly because of the oddity of the generations and how things lined up. Siller and the other two armheads were technically in the generation of Lionel's mother. They had experienced dozens of years of life and were already pushing toward triple-digit ages in another decade or two. As such, when the commotion had been happening back during those days, they were more than old enough to remember. And that also meant that of this third generation, the only ones that were of Lionel and Miguel's age who could participate at this level were just the two of them. There was no third individual. This was to say that Siller knew that Lionel's name had been stricken from the family records. He was also aware that there was some sort of falling out between Lionel's branch of the family and everyone else. But he had always assumed that this was because Lionel's mother had ignored the family's wishes and married out. As for the truth, among the youths, maybe only Miguel was aware. But that was because the innate node was actually within his body. I didn't expect you to be smiling in this situation. Siller tilted his head to the side as though curiously observing Lionel. The other battles had already begun, but the two of them had yet to move a single inch. And what situation is that? Lionel asked. Well, facing an enemy. Siller was a bit confused by Lionel's response. An enemy? Lionel thought for a moment. I don't really see it that way. Siller's brow rose. Is that because you beat Elodie, so you don't really think of me like a rival? That would be a mistake. You're my junior, so I don't mind giving you a few pointers. In the dimensional verse, how powerful you are is sometimes less important than how your abilities match up to someone else. And speed happens to match up well against a lot of things. Siller's irises flashed with a peculiar light, his muscles flexing and unflexing like they had minds of their own, wiggling about his body as though they were ready to explode. No. Lionel shook his head. I don't mean it like that. I just mean that I don't see you all as an enemy. As far as I'm concerned, they'll be leading you all one day. Why would I treat you like that when you haven't personally done anything to me? Siller, who was prepared to go, was stunned speechless. What had he just said? Led them? Was this guy delusional? Are you all right up here? Siller pointed to his head. Do you have any idea how many of them want you dead? Lionel's smile became wider. But, for some reason, it felt decidedly cold. Siller's spine tingled, the tips of his fingers and toes becoming somewhat numb. I don't plan on leading them. I plan on killing them. Siller's palms flipped over on instinct, one short sword and one dagger appearing, each to a hand. He took a step back, his body growing tight and his pupils flickering with lightning. All their lives, the Star Order Council had advised them not to go all out. Despite having fought several exchanges with Elodie and almost killing him, Lionel still didn't know what the latter's ability was. From start to finish, he had only ever used Luxnik's family techniques. However, after the destruction of the Viola family, there was no need to hide their fangs anymore. And Siller had never been more grateful than he was now. For this Lionel before him. He deserved for him to go all out. Because if he didn't, he would definitely suffer. Lionel's palm flipped over soon after. With his duality spear gone, his favorite quasi-silver spear was no longer in his arsenal. But there were still hundreds of others to choose. He was already eyeing a few quasi-gold spears he could see in the far-off distance, but he wasn't quite strong enough to make it there. So instead, he settled for this. The temperature began to drop, a frosted blade appearing in Lionel's hands. It looked like a construct of black ice, its blade looking like a jagged abomination from the depths of hell. The air crackled and popped as the water vapor rapidly cooled. At the same time, a fog of cold and darkness rose from the blade into the air. Siller felt his joint freezing up, the fast twitching of his muscles slowing down considerably. His gaze couldn't help but narrow into slits. Fine. His voice lost the childish tone it usually had, dropping by an octave. I'll show you my true strength then. Bang! An eruption of lightning violently sparked into the surroundings. Siller's short hair, in that instant, became a river of white gold sparks. The whites of his eyes and his irises vanished, replaced by streaking arcs that split out the side of his eyes. He became a man of energy. Then, he vanished. Chapter 1188. Published at 2nd of September 2022 5:05 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1188. Not sure if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1188. Not sure. Lionel swung his spear upward instantaneously, but it was only just barely in time to meet Siller's blade. He was fast. So fast that without activating his snowy star owl's gaze, Lionel's eyes alone could never hope of keeping up. As fast as Siller's legs were, though, his blade was even quicker. He caught the side of Lionel's spear. With blade against blade, he took advantage of his own forward momentum to parry it upward, his sword skimming against the edge of Lionel's spear as the backhand of his dagger aimed directly for Lionel's throat. In the moment, Lionel understood. Siller was the head of the speed arm of the Luxnix family. However, even then, he had only undergone his first awakening of the speed branch, allowing his light elemental force to fuel his speed and leaving trails of light in his wake as he moved. But, compared to Lionel who had awoken 3 times, what was that worth? With things being like this, though, Siller truly showed his colors as the fastest of the Luxnix younger generation. Not only was his grasp of the family's techniques impeccable, but his own personal ability, the one he had been forced to hide for so much of his life, was actually so perfectly in tune with exactly the kind of fighter he wanted to be. While it seemed like Siller was an elemental speedster, this wasn't the case at all. Rather, he was a special type lightning user. His lightning wasn't the destructive type, nor was it a speedster type, it was an energy type. His lightning was able to fuel his body and give him strength. Whether it was improving his thinking speed, his explosive strength and his raw speed, it was able to do it all. This sort of ability was like an overall upgrade on his power, a holistic boost to how dangerous he was. And make no mistake, he was dangerous. Siller's dagger appeared before Lionel's throat, flickering with arcs of lightning. It was impossible to read his gaze with just how much sheer energy was sparking out from it. The speed was so fast that everything happened far too quickly. Many weaker members in the audience didn't even realize just how much danger Lionel was in right that moment. However, what happened next was even more shocking. Lionel's gaze flickered. As though something had sapped Siller of all his energy, the blade trembled and then dulled. All the strength and lightning behind it vanished in a moment. Clang! Siller's blade clashed with Lionel's neck. But as though it had rebounded against a steel wall, it was pushed and repelled backward. Just as quickly, Siller retreated. Like an assassin in the night, he struck just once and didn't stay in Lionel's vicinity. Beneath Lionel's skin, a small flicker of bronze runes receded, hardly perceptible to the eye. However, his steps didn't pause for even a single moment as he pressed down toward Siller. A harsh, grating wind pulsed into the surroundings. Everywhere it passed, ice and icicles formed, turning the stage into some sort of winter wonderland. Lionel took a step forward, his figure flashing. Clang! 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 Siller's brow furrowed, his heated exchange with Lionel growing faster and faster. He felt as though Lionel was either adapting to his speed, or improving so quickly that he was being forced onto his back foot. Ice began to creep up Siller's sword and dagger, his lips turning blue and his fingers trembling beneath the cold. Lionel's short violet hair danced in the wind. The combination of violet, light blues, and a dense darkness played off of each other very well. And yet, compared to the energy-laden Siller, it still felt somewhat muted and uninteresting. The battle slowly swung in Lionel's favor, Siller realizing that his opponent was getting faster and faster. Lionel's spear spun in his hands. It had once been that Siller could attack 3 or 4 times before he landed even one. But then it had shrunk to 3, then 2, then 1. Now, Lionel seemed to attack twice as fast as Siller did. If not for the fact that the latter wielded 2 weapons, he would have likely already suffered a fatal wound. Lionel caught the side of Siller's blade in one of the jagged grooves of his blade. With a strong flick upward, Siller felt his wrist nearly snap, forcing him to get rid of his sword entirely. He moved to retreat once more, but his expression changed when he found that his foot hit air. His eyes widened as he fell on his bottom outside of the stage. He looked on wide-eyed at seemingly empty space, still not quite understanding what happened. It was only after the frost slowly began to recede and he could feel his body again that he finally understood. His mind had actually slowed by that much. That spear. Siller finally looked up, looking at the black ice spear, his expression still somewhat lost. Lionel smiled. You said it best yourself. How powerful you are is sometimes less important than how your abilities match up to someone else. In this case, you met maybe the worst possible match for you. I see. Siller still couldn't quite understand, but he had a faint inkling. He didn't really care that Lionel had relied on a treasure. It was clear that it was a quasi-silver spear, and that wasn't much different from his own weapon. And, something made him think that Lionel had purposely chosen to fight in this way just so he could say those words to him. It was quite pathetic. He finally got the chance to go all out for once, and yet he had lost like this. He could almost feel the disappointed glances that were landing on his back. Lionel bent down and helped Siller to stand before walking away. The latter didn't even register that Lionel had helped him until several moments later, but that only left him in another daze. He wasn't quite sure how he was supposed to feel. Chapter 1189. Published at 2nd of September 2022 5:05 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 1189. Good chance if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1189. Good chance the black ice spear wasn't the true name of the spear, it was just what Lionel had chosen to call it. But, the reality was that this spear had little to nothing to do with ice and frost. In fact, its true name was the kinetic blade and its domain was the kinetic domain. Lionel had made water-type and ice-type spears to choose from in the quasi-silver ranks, but the truth was that this spear wasn't one of them. In fact, this blade worked so well with Lionel because it relied on his fire and light elemental affinity. In this regard, it was even better than the duality spear which played on none of Lionel's best affinities. The reason for the darkness and frost the spear exuded was because it was sapping its domain of light and heat. Lionel hadn't used the darkness ability of the spear at all and simply relied on its ability to absorb kinetic energy. Against an opponent like Siller who relied so heavily on the energy he could output, this spear was, indeed, the perfect counter. Of course, the best part was not only in that Lionel could sap a region of its energy, but he could also use it to fuel the attacks of the spear itself. Lionel hadn't needed to use it against Siller, but it could be very useful in the future. With Lionel's level of fire elemental affinity, he could absorb so much heat that he could bring a fifth-dimensional region to near absolute zero. That kind of power was absolutely lethal. It could only be said that everyone was quite lucky that this was a sixth-dimensional world, or else this selection would basically be over. Did you see it? Orinik asked with narrowed eyes. I'm not sure. It happened too quickly. Ganner said slowly. Orinik had been too infuriated before to think. But, when he thought back to the previous events, Lionel had used his bare fingers to deflect 3 fifth-dimensional arrows. Then, he used a bare fist to leave a dent in fifth-dimensional armor. And, just now, he blocked a fifth-dimensional blade with nothing but the skin of his neck. In his life, Orinik had never heard of defensive abilities on this level, at least not with just one's unaltered skin. It was to the point of being absolutely obscene. Unless, it was from that family. The trouble was, he didn't really have any proof. And, even when it comes to that family, their defense only touches upon these levels when they activate their bronze runes, so why was it that he hadn't seen Lionel's runes? Was it another ability? A technique he had never heard before? Or could it be a mutation of that lineage factor? The last was a strong possibility. After all, with how many members of that family that there were, how could they not have bastard children spotted all over the human domain? Just the recognized children of the Nova generation alone numbered over 1 billion, let alone the unrecognized ones. Why does it matter, anyway? Ganner said. Even if he's from that family, if he's here, he clearly doesn't have high standing amongst them. Why would he be participating in a selection if he could practically get guaranteed entry so long as the right person spoke up? You're always thinking short term. Orinik shook his head. Think about what event is coming soon and what it means. You mean the air war? Yes. And what about it? At our level, we'd just be cannon fodder and barely any of the spoils would be ours for the taking. You can't want me to risk my life just to get a handshake and a pat on the head, right? I'll pass. Orinik ran his fingers and thumb through his brows. He felt like he was talking to a wall. How did such an idiot manage to get into Void Palace? Orinik didn't stay on this line of thought for long, though. When he thought about that massive thing Ganner was always carrying on his back, he couldn't bring himself to belittle the man anymore. That scrawny, half-dead-looking body had far too much strength in it. First of all, cannon fodder is an exaggeration. We'd at least be in the middle levels, enough to get something in return. And, I'm adjusting for my own laziness. Ganner yawned while resting his cheek on a single palm. Orinik couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes this time. As I was saying, the existence of a member of that family with a good bit of talent like this is pretty valuable. Just think about the possibilities. The first potential reality is that his lineage factor mutated. You know how valuable such a thing is. Any mutation, even a regressive one, will want to be studied by even a weak family, let alone one on the level of them. If we sold this information to one of the potential heirs, it would be a great spike in their merits so close to the event, and we would definitely get a nice thank you in return without even having to lift a finger. Ganner's eyes brightened when he heard this. This idea indeed wasn't bad. The fact Lionel's skin could be so hard without fully activating his runes was definitely something they would be interested in. Though it sounded like a great ability, it might still be regressive. After all, there were a ton of complicated variables at play. For all they knew, this mutation didn't allow Lionel's skin to grow any firmer beyond this point. Still, if it was a mutation, it was valuable nonetheless. Every mutation represented the potential of evolving a lineage factor to an all-new level, and it was a chance to deepen one's understanding of the mechanisms that governed it as well. There was simply no family who would turn down such an opportunity. The second potential reality is that he isn't mutated but rather just hides it well. In that case, then he's a pretty decent genius of their family. Isn't that much worse? Ganner's excitement dimmed. Orinik sighed and shook his head. What was he going to do with this one? No. The competition has been raging on for so long already. Those that could be recruited have already long since been recruited, and most of them are focused on grooming their faction to step into higher levels of strength. Someone who isn't tied to any of them and has good talent will always be worth something. Think about it, would you rather split rewards with others who will just leave and bring the benefits to their own families? Or would you rather split rewards with your own kin? If we sell this information to the right person, it won't be as lucrative as the first potential reality, but it will be good business either way. Only after hearing this did Ganner's expression lighten up again. Finally, there's the third potential reality, that he isn't part of that family at all. But, don't you think they'd be very interested in someone who has a body even stronger than their own? Ganner's gaze glowed like twin torches. It seems we'll need to find a way to figure out what the truth is. Orinik smiled as though he could already see the dollar signs. The third day of the selection might be a good chance to see what his limits really are. Last chapter for today. Tomorrow will be a 4-chapter banger, promise. Chapter 1190. Published at 2nd of September 2022, 5:05 and 10 seconds AM. Chapter 1190. erupted forth. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1190 erupted forth. Lionel was unaware of the thoughts of Aurinik and Ganner, but even if he had known, he wouldn't have reacted much. Though the two were trying to profit off of him, they weren't necessarily doing anything detrimental, at least not on the surface, anyway. Even if they were coming with sinister intention, Lionel would be at fault if he was honest with himself. Lionel had no idea just how rare his defenses were. Bodies that could match up to weapons and hardness didn't just grow on trees, and most techniques and lineage factors that replicated such things had enormous drawbacks. Someone like Lionel, who could have amazing speed, flexibility, and dexterity, all while having a body practically immune to blades, was unheard of. In the human race, there was only one family capable of such a feat, and that was without a doubt the Morales. Unfortunately, Lionel's scope of the dimensional verse was still too narrow compared to young nobles, and he never really hid his abilities at all. So, whether they were the ones to expose him or not, he would eventually end up exposing himself regardless. Lionel was already far behind the other heirs, who had already built up their factions and were training in preparation for that day. His anonymity was practically the only shield he had, but it seemed like that wouldn't last for much longer. The battles continued to rage on, and the excitement of the crowd only seemed to grow with each passing moment. Previously, the numbers and auras were all muddled and no one truly understood exactly how things would shake out. But, as more and more battles occurred, a picture of the various groups and standings began to form in the mind of the spectators. Upon grasping who was in which group and how the records were playing out, the excitement began to boil over. Though the Void Palace wasn't here for the entertainment of the masses, their practices ultimately led to such a result regardless. After all, with everyone having to rely on themselves to treat their injuries, any large and clashing battle could make or break the chances of an individual. While it was true that record wouldn't be the ultimate deciding factor of who received entry and who didn't, the more battles one fought, the more accurate those of the Void Palace would be able to be in their assessments. As such, as the battles continued, those that still remained undefeated were separated out from the masses, and their battles became hotly contested centers of hype. Fan clubs clashed with one another over which of their favorites would win, and old, wizened men and women made their predictions in an effort to come off enigmatic. The geniuses of Earth that remained continued to perform to the best of their abilities. In the beginning, Arnold and Milan were practically neck and neck, but the more battles he fought, the more refined Arnold's style seemed to become. He improved in real time, steadily pushing his win percentage of barely 40 to 50%, upward toward 60. Milan lagged behind, not sharing Arnold's talent in the use of universal force and as such performing the worst of them all. But, he didn't lose sight of his determination, managing to keep his head high and take his licks in silence. Carolus, Elther and Noah all performed extremely well from the very beginning. Elther was a lot like Arnold, improving rapidly with every battle. He was the quintessential battle maniac, his blood boiling every time he stepped onto the arena. When he was finally forced to use his battle form, morphing into an enormous, white-furred wall of muscle with horns that pierced the skies, the furries in the crowd only seemed to go more wild. However, what the crowd saw and what Aurinik and Ganner saw were two completely different things entirely. While the former saw a wall of muscle, the latter saw chaotic particle force. What the hell is going on with this sector? First there was a true state universal force wielder, then there was a member of that family, and now there's someone wielding one of the true state elements. Aurinik felt like his head was spinning. They all come from over there, Ganner said offhandedly. Though he had spoken those words casually, Aurinik froze upon hearing them, his head turning toward the location of Earth's geniuses. He had been so busy analyzing how ridiculous it all seemed that he had completely missed the most obvious connection of them all. His gaze went toward Earth's geniuses and he immediately noticed something else. Not only were they all from this one place, they all seemed to look toward a singular young man for guidance. No matter which of them it was, even the chaotic particle force wielder, after each of their battles, they would always go to him to hear his thoughts. Just when Aurinik's gaze landed on Lionel, he seemed to look up at the same time and smile. Aurinik didn't know if it was a coincidence or not, but Lionel's gaze seemed to convey the message that he could see through his intentions quite clearly. A member of that family leading so many talents. If I recall correctly, not a single one of them is above tier 2 except for him, yet they didn't perform too badly. They're just too young. Orinik thought aloud to himself, not shifting away from Lionel's gaze. Hey Ganner, I think the price for him just went up. A lone member of that family was one matter. But, a member who had a talented faction under him was worth even more. Life in the Void Palace wasn't easy, you had to scratch and claw for everything. The idea of a payday that could come without him having to risk his life was something that made Orinik's blood boil and his heart stand at attention. The billboard flickered once more, causing Lionel to finally break eye contact with Orinik. Lionel Morales versus Isaac Arundo. The moment Lionel landed on the platform, a baleful killing intent that blanketed the arena erupted forth. Chapter 1191. Published at 2nd of September 2022 5:05 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 1191. Bowman, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1191. Bowman. Lionel sighed. He could feel the rage of the young man across from him, and considering the bow in his hands and the shape of his features, he could guess why. This young man was probably of the Arundo family and very likely related that Isaac character he had killed previously with a combination of his bat construct and his radiant fire force. Resonance and vibrations were already dangerous enough on their own, let alone when they were paired with a force capable of destroying cells down to a molecular level. Back then, Lionel had only wanted to casually try out what the combination would give him, and the result was devastating for Isaac. To say the least. Isaac had been forced to hold down his rage and fury for days, being held back by even his own family members so he didn't rush out and do something that ruined his future. Though, Isaac never expected to be so lucky as to get Lionel in his group. He slowly pulled the bow from his back, his gaze locked onto Lionel. If something like a simple look could kill, there was no doubt that maybe Lionel would have died several times over. Lionel decided against saying anything. Sometimes, this was the best course of action. Oftentimes in life, there was no one in the wrong, and yet, you would have to be on opposing sides regardless. Seeing the bow in Isaac's hands, though, something within Lionel shifted. He couldn't remember ever running into a true bowman yet. In his life, he had never met anyone more accurate or skilled than himself in this respect. He really wanted to see just what kind of strength a family of bowmen could produce. Lionel's palm flipped over, revealing a sleek black bow. It was quite a beautiful construct, but its quasi-bronze level had long since become outdated. Even still, it had followed Lionel for several years already. Of all his weapons, this was the one he was probably the most familiar with. The gazes of the Arundo family flashed with rage when they saw Lionel's actions. They couldn't see into his thoughts. How could they believe that he was doing anything more than mocking them? Lionel had displayed skill in the Luxnix force arts and the spear, but now he wanted to be a bowman too. But Isaac felt completely different. There was something about Lionel's demeanor that shifted when the bow touched his palm. He went from a normal young man to a towering mountain. An invisible pressure pressed downward as though there was no distance that was safe, no defense that was impenetrable. Today, Isaac thought to himself, slowly drawing his first arrow and tightening his back. Even if I have to give up my life, I will take you down with me. Twang. TSSSSS. 2 streaking arrows were released at once, each from opposite sides of the arena. At least, that was what it would seem like. However, if one had been paying especially close attention, it would have been just barely perceptible that Lionel had released a fraction of a moment later. Isaac's gaze flickered, numerous calculations being performed in his mind every second. He deduced the ending in a fraction of a moment and released a second arrow and a third. Lionel took a step to the side. His hands became a blur, mirroring Isaac's actions in a single blink. Bang! The first 2 arrows collided, creating a scene that stunned those watching. They split into 4 pieces, each one being split in 2 by the other in an astonishing feat the crowd had simply never seen before. Never had 2 arrows been so perfectly matched in such a way. But, such a sight didn't even have time to settle in before the second and third volleys met one another. Lionel's expression flickered, a wide grin spreading across his face. I6's second arrow deviated in its path just before it met his own second. Skimming against the side, it threw Lionel's second arrow off course and right in the path of I6's own third arrow. In just a breath, Isaac used Lionel's second arrow to deviate the path of his own third arrow, forcing Lionel's own third arrow to miss completely. Lionel's second arrow flew by the right of I6's head and the third flew by the left of his waist. But, he didn't move a single inch as though he already knew that exactly this would happen. At the same time, the forced deviation of I6's third arrow by Lionel's second resulted in both of I6's arrows flying in a straight line, right for Lionel's head. For the first time in his life, Lionel had been outmaneuvered in a battle of snipers. But, rather than being enraged or saddened, he laughed, a vast violet aura exuding from him without his even noticing. Lionel was forced to tilt his head to the side to dodge I6's line of arrows. But, in the split moment of being off balance, Isaac had already launched 4 more arrows, his gaze focused and his mind running on overdrive. He had never felt so focused in his life, so absolutely in control. This battle. He would win it. Right when Lionel shifted his head to the side, the first in line's second arrow suddenly dipped down, ripping into his shoulder. A skidding white mark was left on Lionel's skin as the arrow almost drew blood. His mind had been quick enough to pick up on the change, but he hadn't been quick enough to activate his bronze runes in that area, causing the white mark that was there now. But, Isaac seemed to have already long since been aware of how strong Lionel's body was, because the third arrow which had been following the trail of the second fell in line perfectly. As though taking the white mark on Lionel's shoulder as a landing strip, it burst with a flood of force, piercing into Lionel's left shoulder. A spray of blood began to fall down Lionel's arm, his grip over his bow turning somewhat weak. However, there was no chance for rest. A volley of 4 arrows was already in the air and it was hard to tell just what sort of unpredictable tricks Isaac had hidden within them. Chapter 1192. Published at 2nd of September 2022 5:05 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1192, LT seemed. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1192 LT seemed. Lionel's expression flickered. The instant the force surrounding the arrow lodged into his shoulder dissipated, he used his variant earth affinity to send it flying out of his flesh. The wound itself immediately began to heal, Lionel's passive healing factor having reached ridiculous levels after reaching the second awakening of his healing branch. Isaac hadn't expected for Lionel to deal with his wounds so effortlessly, so he was somewhat caught off guard. This wasn't because he thought his arrow would be lethal, but rather because he expected Lionel to have to be forced to find a moment to pull the arrow out. And he thought that Lionel would also have to at least weather the injury for the duration of the battle. But, it seemed that he was wrong. Isaac's expression fell for only a split moment before his determination was lit ablaze once more. His gaze rapidly shifted between the 4 arrows he had released into the sky, completing another series of calculations in the blink of an eye. His aura blazed, his bow force wrapping around his body like a howling wind. The twang of his bow string became like the chords of a symphony. Every pull and release had its own unique rhythm. He didn't care about the depletion of his state of mind, he didn't care about the tingling pain at the tips of his fingers, he didn't care about anything outside of the target right before him. Lionel rolled to the side. Having lost the initiative, his body was forced into weaving and dodging, his gaze flickering with an excited light. Isaac was the best marksman he had ever met. His skill was immaculate. His calculative abilities were lesser than that of himself, but his talent and grasp of timing were impeccable. The moment he seized a leg up due to a folly on Lionel's part, he didn't let up, his assault only becoming more overbearing and relentless. There was no cover for Lionel to take, no partner he could use to distract his enemy, and as though by some tacit agreement between the two, Lionel refused to use any skills classified outside his talent as a bowman. Bang! 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 Plumes of smoke rose up outside the arena as arrow after arrow left craters in their wake. Steam began to rise off of I6's skin. His fingers trickled with blood, his back burned from the strain and his shoulders cried out. But he pulled one arrow after another, slowly forcing Lionel back into a corner where he wouldn't be able to step either left or right. Isaac slowly shifted to the side, taking his first steps of the battle. His base remained steady and his feet were heavy. Everything he did was perfect and without flaw. He forgot about everything else, his mind touching an ethereal state where even the pain and aching of his body vanished. And then, bang! A towering pillar of force rose into the skies. I6's aura shifted, his arrows beginning to carry with them the screeching sounds of metal grating on metal as they tore through the skies. At that moment, Orinik and Ganner's gazes narrowed, their expressions becoming serious. Natural bow force. Under the shocked gazes of the crowd, Isaac broke through just as he forced Lionel into a corner. And yet, the man himself didn't even seem to notice. All he could think about was growing powerful enough to defeat the enemy before him, releasing an arrow with enough strength to rip through any defense before him. Shoo! Shu! Shoo! Shoo! The arrows whistled through the skies, their momentum leaving streaks across space and threatening to tear lines into the fabric of reality. However, while they were far from accomplishing such a feat, they were more than enough to shred apart Lionel's defenses. Bang! 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 A cloud of dust billowed into the skies, covering the scene of everything in the corner of the arena. The crowd watched on in awe. A battle that had started with such a fascinating beginning had turned completely one-sided and lost much of their attention. But, the instant of I6's breakthrough, it was as though all eyes had been glued to him. Natural bow force. Wasn't the conclusion obvious? However, right then, before the smoke could completely clear, a laughter sounded from within it, causing the plumes of debris to forcefully disperse. Lionel's figure was revealed. Much of his clothing had been drenched in blood, but the skin beneath was completely unscathed. What was obvious was the fact the final volley of arrows carrying natural bow force hadn't touched a single hair on his head. I understand now, it makes so much sense. So you can use bow force like that. Lionel was absolutely fascinated. When he thought of the potential applications and what he could do when he gained the skill to do so, he was ecstatic. Maybe he didn't even realize how much he loved the bow until now. Maybe he loved it even more than he did crafting. It was almost a shame that he was given the spear domain heirloom instead of the bow domain heirloom. Let's finish this. Lionel, who was now confident in his ability to dodge I6's arrows, stood to his full height, tall and proud. He didn't seem prepared to run as he drew his bow, even knowing that Isaac held the initiative in his hands. He exuded all the unbridled confidence in the world. However, just as Lionel was about to knock another arrow to begin his counter, he blinked, slowly lowering his hands. Isaac still stood tall, blood trickling from his fingers, but he was completely unmoving. He swayed slightly in the wind before he fell backward, crashing outside of the arena. He had given everything he had in that last strike. By the time the last arrow was released, he had already lost consciousness. He was in no state to battle. It seemed that Lionel had won. Chapter 1193. Published at 2nd of September 2022 9:15 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1193. Hushed. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1193. Hushed. Lionel returned to Earth's seating arrangements a bit disappointed, but also somewhat relieved. He didn't want to have to kill Isaac. Not only had he just enlightened him to many things, but he also understood where Isaac was coming from. Lionel had long since grown past the point of allowing guilt to weigh down his soul and threaten his life. But, he had also come to the conclusion that those that wanted revenge on him for things he had done in the past weren't individuals he would hate. In the future, he would have to cross and harm a lot of people. That was a weight he would have to carry on his shoulders and accept. The moment Lionel sat back down, after appeasing his grandmother and insisting that he was doing just fine, he immediately entered a state of meditation as the battles raged around him. The battles started up again in full force, but Lionel had entered his dream world, several dream clones standing around and performing the same actions again and again. Lionel was absolutely fascinated by I6 bowmanship not only because of its applications, but also its simplicity. Although the amount of skill it took to use it at high levels was obscene, the entry was simple. It was the sort of thing that was accessible to everyone but very difficult to get extremely skilled at. Kind of like driving a car. Anyone could take a vehicle from point A to point B. But, how fast could you drive a car without losing control of it? 150 kilometers an hour? 200 maybe? Anyone could park, but how many could parallel park with ease? And what about drifting into your parking spot? Anyone could drive manual, but how many could drive automatic? The layers of complexity and skill increased almost instantly. Similarly, I6 bowmanship started simple but very quickly became complicated. In the start, it was a game of balance and projectiles, but then it evolved into aerodynamics and fluid dynamics, and at its highest levels became the physics of chaos and chaotic events. To make a potential complex matter simple, Isaac essentially coded his arrows in bow force, decided the shape and weight the bow force would take before he released the arrow. All of the random movements of his arrows from start to finish had never been a form of telekinesis or a special mind technique, but were rather all examples of bow force manipulation. By tweaking and adjusting how bow force was applied to an arrow, you could cause delayed and seemingly random events to occur long after it had left the bow. The result was catching even someone like Lionel, who almost always had everything in his grasp, completely off guard. The most shocking part of it was that the more clever one was with their application, and the more decoys you used, the more complicated the calculations became and the more difficult it was for a person to see through the truth. Lionel was so used to being able to directly pinpoint the trajectory of an arrow or projectile because it always followed a simple parabolic shape. He only had to take into account gravity and the force behind it, adding in a sample of the sound it caused for extra measure, and he could tell almost everything about it from the location it was shot from to exactly where it would land in the blink of an eye. But, with this, it was like Lionel's world had been turned completely upside down. Fluid dynamics was among the hardest branches of physics even in the 25th century. The variables only increased as you rose through the dimensions. And, this wasn't even the most complicated application of I6 bowmanship that Lionel could think of. Lionel was so immersed in his own world that it took a tap from his grandmother for him to realize that it was actually once again his turn. Oh, right. Lionel smiled. The depth of complexity was so great that even after that session, Lionel felt that he had only touched the tip of the iceberg. The way force interacted with regular bow force versus natural bow force versus enlightened bow force varied so wildly that Lionel had to prepare separate calculations for each. Then there was the matter of considering the atmosphere he was in, the kind of force his enemy was proficient in, and even how fast or slow his opponent was breathing. If Lionel wanted to be as accurate as he normally was with normal arrows, he had to take even the tiniest detail into account. Lionel was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't even realize that the crowd released a deafening cheer when he stepped onto the arena. They were so excited by the next matchup that they let it all out. Right, I didn't check. Lionel rose his head to look at the billboard. But, his eyes caught sight of something that made him realize there was no point. Before him, a beauty holding a mask in one hand and a battle axe in the other stood. Aina met Lionel's placid gaze with her own cool amber one, the delicate sculpting of her features revealed for all to see. No one knew why Aina had taken her mask off, but Lionel had a few guesses. Either way, she crushed the mask between the squeeze of her long and slender fingers, a bloodthirsty killing intent hanging around her. The shards of the mask falling to the ground seemed to be the signal for the battle's start. Aina's force became like a towering pillar of crimson. The quantity and quality being so much that it felt like the entire arena would collapse. Even before she moved, the stage beneath their feet shattered like an egg, making it difficult to tell just where it began and just where it ended. Lionel found himself falling as the platform collapsed, his feet still beneath him as his gaze remained locked onto his opponent. Bang! Aina accelerated forth. Her speed was so blazing that it put Siller to shame. The difference might as well have been night and day. Her long black hair fluttered to her back, her amber irises glowed with a fierce gold, the stride of her long legs and the tone of her powerful torso winding up as she raised her battle axe. The shimmering blade reflected the sun's light as she chopped down toward Lionel's head. In what felt like the blink of an eye, she had already appeared before him, her strength causing the arena to tremble and quake. Bang! She sliced down with all of her might. Orinic's expression changed. Protection. The billboard in the skies hurriedly glowed, sending out a wave of force that protected and reinforced the surroundings. A blade force shot through the earth, rising like a wall of dividing light and continuing to the point it crashed against the spectator stands. Screams of horror and fear resounded as the golden barrier quaked, threatening to crack beneath the pressure and collapse entirely. The strength was absolutely unfathomable. If Orinik hadn't reacted so quickly, it was impossible to tell just what would have happened to the arena. Numerous gazes landed on the collapsed stage, no one caring for even a moment about the other battles that had been forced to stop amidst all the commotion. But, what they saw when the smoke cleared was something they would have never expected to see. Their goddess had her head buried into a man's chest, uncaring for his bloody and sweaty mess of a ripped shirt. She wrapped her arms around him so tightly that it seemed as though she was scared he would disappear. A hushed silence fell over the arena. Chapter 1194. Published at 2nd of September 2022 9:15 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1194. Thoughtful words. 1. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1194. Thoughtful words. 1. The battle between Lionel and Aina wasn't even meant to occur so quickly. As two undefeated participants, their turns should have been delayed as much as possible. But, due to how poor Lionel had looked in his battle with Isaac, and the fact Isaac himself was also undefeated for the time being, despite winning, Lionel lost priority to the Arundo family heir. The result of these series of events was this battle occurring a lot earlier than anyone could have expected. But, even then, no one could have expected a fight with such an explosive start could end like this. First, some held the hope that maybe Aina was using some sort of bear hug attack. As for why she would do such a thing when she had an enormous battle axe at her disposal, who knew? But, when it came to matters of fandoms and unrequited love, people were willing to believe the most ridiculous of things. But, it soon became apparent that this wasn't what was happening at all. No one knew what to do. The other battles had come to a grinding halt, the audience's attention was entirely on the duo, and even Orinik had no idea what he's supposed to do to. Shit. And here I thought because that Viola family was wiped out she would be easy pickings. Ganner mumbled beneath his breath. Even when the Void Palace was taken into account, Ganner could only think of maybe 2 or 3 beauties on the level of Aina, and each of them was far beyond his reach. He was starting to regret having volunteered to come to this place. There was nothing but disappointment around every corner. If Aina was untalented, he might still be able to do something. But, from what it seemed from her previous battles, one of those golden tokens was almost guaranteed to be for her. If it wasn't certain before, that attack just now practically set it in stone. Wait, this is a huge scandal, isn't it? Ganner suddenly began to laugh. That Richard guy said she was his fiancée. Then that Miguel guy went to save her and there's a bunch of rumors going around about that. But now she's hugging a third guy on stage. Fuck, this is more entertaining than watching these weaklings battle. Ganner slapped his arm rest, finally sitting up for the first time. All he lacked was a bucket of popcorn. Orinik couldn't help but roll his eyes. The mighty Void Palace's selection had turned into a soap opera and this guy was just eating it up. Where was the dignity and pride he should have had as a disciple of the strongest organization of the human domain? Orinik didn't seem to notice that while he was shaking his head, his eyes, too, hadn't left the scene before him. Orinik and Ganner weren't the only ones with their own reactions. When it came to the geniuses of Earth, not to mention Savon, Yuri and Miel, they were all stunned. Even Lionel's grandmother wasn't sure of how she should be reacting. She felt like she was in the middle of a teenage drama she was about 200 years too old for. Well, she's very beautiful. But, what about her character? My grandson doesn't seem to be very happy with her. What do I do? Roja felt the need to remind her grandson that when a man draws a boundary, he should keep it, or else his woman would never respect him the way that she should. However, she felt that it wasn't her place to overstep again. She still felt like she was walking on eggshells around her grandson, scared to push him away. It was the kind of thing that could only be solved with time and patience. No matter how much Lionel said it wasn't a big matter, Roja still felt the need to only slowly integrate herself. As for Lionel's brothers, they were stuck between deciding whether they should be high-fiving or preparing for the next World War. When it came to the women, their eyes glowed as though they were watching a great romance unfold before them, their hearts fluttering as they wondered when they too would meet the man of their dreams. Savon and Yuri looked toward one another. They felt that Aina had way too many surprises in store for them. Neither of them had ever expected things to go down this route. They had spent the last couple days with Aina, but she seemed to be no different from the Aina they had known long before her personality was taken away from her. It was difficult to tell what had changed or what was truly going on in her mind. In that time, they had all dodged the issue of Lionel not wanting to hurt Aina. And Aina herself never brought him up, so they had never gotten an accurate read on what her thoughts were. In fact, now that they thought about it, Aina should have figured out that Lionel was in her group a while ago. They had been preparing for their own battles so much that they hadn't picked up on these tiny details, but she most definitely had. This should mean that this matter was likely planned by her. She had wanted to do this from the very beginning. But, what exactly would the result be? Emil himself watched on with a complicated expression. This was his daughter, his little girl. Every father would feel some hesitation when it came to trusting their children in choosing their partners for a lifetime. For Emil, it was especially difficult because he knew everything that Aina had gone through. After all, much of it was his fault to begin with. He knew that his daughter had had her first boyfriend while he was away, but this was the first time he had laid eyes on the young man while knowing that he was the boyfriend in question. He couldn't help but stare at Lionel's face for a very long time, his brows furrowing into a deep frown. Aina, though, didn't seem to care about the eyes and ears and everyone else. In her world, there was no one else but her and the young man before her. She controlled her breathing, taking in his scent and trying not to allow the wave of familiarity and comfort to overwhelm her emotions. When she finally settled the violent trembling of her throat, she began to speak words she had thought about endlessly over the last several days. I'm sorry. Chapter 1195. Published at 2nd of September 2022 9:15 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 1195. Thoughtful words. 2. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1195. Thoughtful words. 2. The voice was soft, but there were too many strong individuals in attendance for it not to be hard. But once again, it was as though Aina couldn't be bothered to care. Usually, it was always Lionel putting up sound barriers making the two of them invisible. Aina didn't know how to communicate silently nor did she care to. I know the words don't mean much, but I still wanted to say them. I know that I hurt you. I was so worried about protecting myself and putting up barriers so I wouldn't have to suffer pain again that I put the only man I cared about in harm's way. There's nothing that I can say to change what I've already done, but I still want to say these things. No matter how this ends, the one thing I don't want you to think is that I don't care for you. In fact, I care for you so much that I often don't know what to do with myself. It controls so much of my day, takes up so much of my mind, and yet I've never really told you. Aina squeezed Lionel hard, her eyes squeezing shut. PN0L, she could remember all the times that Lionel had shown her care and affection, how much effort he had put into chasing her for so long and how persistent he was in making sure that she was always happy. There was never anything that Lionel did that hurt her that was done with another choice at hand, and even the things that did leave her shambles were actions he took that were for her benefit. Ultimately, he had wanted to protect her. But, how much had she protected him? Aina could think of so many times Lionel's care for her was clear and obvious, but when she placed the same scope on herself, why was it that she couldn't do the same? What did she give him? Her body? Was that all she could do to show her affection? What then was different from her compared to any other woman? But when Aina recalled her memories, remembering the ups and downs of their relationship, she realized that it wasn't that she hadn't done anything. It was rather that she was so focused on barring herself from the world that the things she had done might as well have not been done at all. I'm not very good at speaking about how I feel. But I want to become better at it even if it's embarrassing. Aina grit her teeth. These were things she never thought she would tell Lionel, things she thought she would take with her to the grave. However, faced with the idea of losing Lionel forever and realizing that maybe she might never have another chance like this, she had resolved herself to do it. And there was no person better for her to lean on while she did so than the man she had before her now. The reason she had attacked so viciously at the beginning, the reason why she had made it look like she was going to strike all out, was because this was the only way she could make certain that Lionel wouldn't dodge out of the way. It sounded ridiculous when you said it like that. After all, she was attacking him, why wouldn't he move? But Aina knew Lionel very well. She knew him so well that she was certain that he'd be able to read the trajectory of her attack even when no one else could. Aina understood where Lionel's head space was at right now. He probably wanted nothing to do with her. If she tried to hug him normally, it would have never worked. She had to catch him off guard. It was ironic. But only with his support could she speak these words. Because without him, she felt lost and alone. I liked you from the first time we met. You always had a bright smile and everyone seemed to gravitate toward you. I couldn't really understand because your status was so much lower than theirs. Those noble kids like to snub their nose at everything, but you seem to always be able to get past those barriers. When you confessed to me a few days later, I was immediately overwhelmed. Embarrassment wasn't an emotion I think I had ever felt in life up until that point. But, for some reason, meeting gazes with you for the first time snapped something into place within me, and it was as though I could finally feel within the normal range of what a person should. When Aina began, she seemed to still be hesitant and slow. But as she continued, her words flowed much smoother and faster. It became easier as she continued, as though it truly was just her and Lionel. I really wanted to say yes, it was my first instinct. I didn't think about anything else and it was at the tip of my tongue. But my body shut down and I forgot how to think. I was too embarrassed to even respond, so I ran away instead. And after running away the first time, for some reason, it only became harder and harder to say the word I wanted to from the very beginning. I began to make excuses and focus more and more on the very goal I had had from the very beginning. Revenge for my mother was too important to me to consider other things, or at least that's what I convinced myself of. And maybe it was one part true, but after seeing your talent, it became nothing more than an excuse I told myself to not be forced to confront it. Instead of facing my feelings, I hid from them and they began to pop up in the worst of ways. Sometimes it was benign, but other times it became very dangerous. I almost reached a point where I didn't care about anything else, so long as I could satisfy myself in these small ways no one else would ever know about. And it all started with my hair. Chapter 1196. Published at 2nd of September 2022, 9:15 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 1196. Thoughtful words. 3. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1196. Thoughtful words. 3. It started off fairly innocent. I like to learn things about you and found methods of doing so. I couldn't go to your games because they were often at night and there was a small period of time between classes and curfew I could use to train. But I always watched the live streams. During one of your post-game interviews, the interviewer asked you whether you preferred girls with short or long hair. I remember not liking the question. Shouldn't she have been asking you about football? And why was she so flirty? But I distinctly remember you saying long hair. Back then, I remember being traumatized and I agonized over it for several days. A part of me thought you just answered randomly because the interviewer made you uncomfortable. But another part of me couldn't help but look in the mirror, hating my short hair. I always found long hair to be annoying. It also got in the way, it took way too long to dry after a shower, and whenever I trained I had to make extra care not to let it get tangled or caught by an opponent. But, after that day, I couldn't bring myself to cut it anymore. Aina thought too highly of Lionel's opinion. Even if it was a joke, even if it was an offhanded comment to get the interviewer off of his back, she still did it at a great inconvenience to herself. She had always been about optimizing her training, but for the first time in her life, she chose to do something decidedly against her philosophy, just for the small chance at making Lionel happy. She lost count of the number of times she had done exactly that. She stopped wearing tomboyish clothes and started wearing dresses to school. She began to worry about her appearance a lot, even changing the settings of the mask that hid her scars to a slightly more beautiful setting. She even remembered regretting choosing a setting that was so normal when she could have made herself the most beautiful girl in school with the change of a few settings. These were all small and petty things she did for herself that no one could ever prove otherwise. They were all small and under the table, and many of them happened over such a long course of time that Lionel would have never thought that he was the trigger for any of it. Many would have thought that Aina was simply growing up, sliding into her feminine charms more as she matured just like every other little girl did. How many young girls were boorish tomboys in their youth, only to become prim and proper young ladies when they grew? It wasn't a rare thing at all. But Aina was practically going against everything she was, just to fit into an archetype she wasn't even sure that Lionel liked. She couldn't talk to him outside a classroom setting without her brain turning into a bonfire, so all she could do was pick up hints and clues from his passerby conversations with his friends and the tidbits she grasped from interviews. She built an entire persona, a woman that wasn't even truly herself, just to make Lionel happy. And the sad part. He had already liked her. He had already said as much. In fact, he told her almost every day, without reserve and without the slightest hint of embarrassment. I remember every time you confessed, I could recall them all. And each time, I respected you so much more, liked you so much more, because you could do exactly what I seemed to have no ability to do. Express your feelings as openly and honestly as you want to. Aina poured out her soul. She didn't hide even the most embarrassing things she had done, like the time she painted the nails on one hand blue and the other violet and tried to see which one Lionel noticed because she couldn't figure out which was his favorite color. Or the time she did hanging drills at the end of her training, hoping she would lengthen her spine during the period she thought Lionel might like taller girls. Or that time she spent practically all the money she had earned during one of her summer internships on a jersey signed by Lionel that, to this day, sat in a corner of her spatial ring. A jersey she never thought would ever see the light of day. She spilled practically everything a young and naive girl would do for the sake of her crush. Except the difference was that normally nobody else but her should have been aware of this obsession, but she revealed it all without holding back as though she was truly scared that Lionel wouldn't understand just how much she cared. I did all of these things but I could never take the final step. And I knew that I was running out of time. That day was coming and afterward, I didn't know if I would ever see you again. It was one of the greatest regrets of my life, not being able to drum up the courage to explain things to you. Aina wasn't wrong to feel so guilty. In her worldview, Lionel was of common birth and his gene analysis exam was also unimpressive. By all rights, he shouldn't have been a talent of any kind and he would likely be among the very first to die during the metamorphosis. Aina's own crippling anxiety led her to the point where she chose her own comfort over potentially saving the life of the young man she had pined over for 4 years already. It was then that she should have realized just how much of a problem her own emotions were becoming. It was then she should have realized that she was letting something other than her reason dictate her actions. But by then, it was already too late. I was racked with guilt and I couldn't even look you in the eye. Things only became worse after the first trial and my benign actions became decidedly less so. Chapter 1197. Back when the metamorphosis first descended, Lionel remembered thinking that this was really the end and that this would really be how he died. He had already concluded that the Paradise Islands had fallen and his father was dead, and now he was certain that he would follow not long afterward. In those moments, he felt lost and alone. He remembered the only thing he had wanted in those final seconds he thought he had was for Aina to look at him, to just spare him one glance as that portal-like wormhole approached them. He remembered feeling as though his heart was being stabbed through because even then, even when there was nothing else to live for, the girl he had chased for 4 years didn't even want to look at him. Even now, he could remember how each individual strand of her hair had fallen to the back of her head before he was sucked away and completely lost consciousness. However, what he hadn't known was that Aina didn't look him in the eye because she couldn't. In those moments, she thought that Lionel was dead, that she would never see him again. It hurt for Aina to admit any of this, but she gritted her teeth and did so anyway. She felt that she had to. When I saw you came out alive, I was the happiest I had been in a long time. But, I felt that I didn't deserve you. I had done such a horrible thing all because I couldn't open my mouth to speak, so I did something I thought would make you hate me. And I killed Conrad in the most gruesome way possible. Even now, Aina could remember Lionel's smile fading from its usual bright ray of sunshine. That was the moment the thing she did for Lionel became twisted and dark, so much so that she had a hard time even looking at herself. I realized soon after that what I did was wrong. You had been going through a tough time back then, adjusting to a new world. And, instead of supporting you like I should have, I gave you another dose of trauma. Aina didn't realize how bad it was until Lionel went out to fight those great invalids all on his own. He was suicidal and it was her who had pushed him to that point. Visit. For a better user experience, of course, this wasn't true. Lionel had also let himself be killed by that Mayan girl, his guilt having become far too much. But, this wasn't something Aina learned until much later, so the guilt of pushing the man she cared for to such a point weighed on her even heavier. And now, she had almost caused Lionel's death not just once, but twice. Luckily, I was able to find you before things got any worse. But I still couldn't open my mouth to say anything. When those bandits came to take advantage of how tired you were and I saw how angry you got when they disrespected me, even to the point of not caring about the deaths and killing them directly, one part of me felt happier than she ever had, but another part only felt even more guilty. Me, being the idiot that I am, instead of expressing that in words, punched you in the chest to wake you up from your anger. I was just so mad that you kept putting others before yourself, that you kept putting me, a woman who didn't deserve your care or affection, before yourself. Aina bit down on her lip hard, as she brought herself to parts of her planned words that were the hardest to say. Even compared to the others, she found that she was almost dying on the inside piece by piece as she said them, but she refused to repeat her past mistakes. Aina took a deep breath. Your memory is very good, so I'm sure you remember the Joan of Arc zone we entered. Back then, I didn't know what to do and I felt like I was making mistake after mistake. Not even the small kinds of mistakes, the kinds of mistakes that you couldn't take back and you would regret for a lifetime. But to the me of back then, the appearance of that zone was like a heaven-sent opportunity. Despite the fact I knew it was an 8-person limit, I lied to you and said that it was 2, visit. For a better user experience, Lionel remembered this especially well. He remembered Uncle Montez telling him that maybe the easiest thing for a scanning device to do was set the entry limit. It might make a mistake in deciding exactly what the quests and main mission were, but it would never make a mistake in something so fundamental and easy to measure. Lionel had already concluded back then that Aina lied to him, but he didn't mind. The time they spent in the zone had brought them closer together and he had already put his rose-tinted glasses back on. He had also learned about her family back then, so he had assumed that she wanted to gather more treasures to get stronger, faster. But, he had never thought that the truth was. I wanted to spend time with you. I didn't know how to make it happen, but this was the very first chance we seemed to have. I never seemed to have trouble talking with you in class about work-related things, so I thought that if we had a task to finish together, it would be easier for me to finally speak with you. And I was right, we grew a lot closer, but I still felt a heavy amount of guilt. This was something I ran from for a long time. Even when we fought against the Royal Blue Fort together and you teleported me away, the fear of being found out by you fueled my anxiety even more, and it made me shut down the possibility of coming back. I didn't trust you with my burdens. I didn't tell you the truth about a lot of things. I couldn't even bring myself to explain how I almost died at the puppet master's hands. But it was never your fault, it was always mine. I didn't trust you because I couldn't even trust myself. I made so many mistakes, hurt you in so many ways. Aina finally couldn't hold back her tears. They began to drench Lionel's chest like a flood. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Lionel. Please let me make it up to you. I'll spend the rest of my life doing so if that's what it takes. I love you. Aina gripped the back of Lionel's shirt hard, pushing out those final words with all the strength she could muster. She struggled to clear her gaze, looking up with what little stamina she had left. It was like explaining all of these things had left her beaten and battered, her heart itself being covered in bruises of blue, green, purple, and the deepest of blacks. But what she saw when her head looked up left her breathless, as though she had been knocked down once again, her barely paused tears coming back in a second torrent. However, this stream seemed far from finishing. Those indifferent pale violet eyes looked down at her. They didn't carry hatred or malice. It was almost as though they were gazing upon a stranger, a person of times long since past, a woman it had no feelings for. And then, his lips moved. So what? Author's note, FUCK. I had to binge so much Andrew Tate to type out those last two words. I need a cleanse. I'm gonna go hit the gym hard then drown myself to sleep. Until tomorrow, lads, cries why Lionel, why, visit. For a better _user experience. Chapter 1198. Aina felt a crushing feeling in her chest, her vision going dark for a moment. She wasn't quite sure how to breathe or even think any longer. Her hands slipped from Lionel, her arms no longer seeming to have the strength to hold on. Her knees grew weak, and an imbalance she would have easily been able to correct in her peak condition was her undoing. She fell to her butt, her vision blurred and her mind foggy. The wind seemed to be sucked out of the arena, a response no one could have expected falling to their ears. However, the silence that followed didn't last very long at all. I'll kill you. The enraged roar shook the arena even more violently than anything Aina could have done. The golden barrier of force directly shattered in one location, forming an enormous hole as a streak of crimson tore a path out from it, the furious howl of a father penetrating the skies. Lionel didn't even have the time to turn his head in that direction. All he could do was stir his lineage factor, his bronze runes vibrating to life in full force and a halo wafting with violet fog appearing above his head. Bang! The fist threatened to collapse an entire side of Lionel's face. Visit. For a better user experience, the skin of Lionel's cheek splintered, the bone beneath cracking, and his eye on that side went completely blind. His body went limp for a moment, his brain rattling around his skull like an unleashed ping-pong ball before he shot out from his position like a speeding bullet. The wind howled and whistled, much of what remained of Lionel's shirt shearing apart beneath the pressure. Before Lionel even landed at his new location, Meal violently coughed up a mouthful of blood. But he completely ignored the feeling of his inner organs shearing to pieces as he prepared to launch an even more powerful attack. Much of his momentum and force had been dissipated by the golden barrier, and his own injuries which had yet to heal definitely didn't help. But all he could see was red. If he didn't kill this boy right here and now, he wouldn't know what to do with himself. Bang! Lionel crashed into the golden barrier, his entire body suddenly becoming racked by a wave of pain. Wave after wave surged through him as he felt his bones snap one after another. Even after using his runes to disperse the impact and spread it throughout himself, the result was just more of his body being torn apart. His one good eye, however, continued to look forward, a frosty light hidden within them as they watched Meal preparing to jump forward one more time. The look within those pale violet depths could only be described as malevolent. A smoldering abyssal valley of darkness and destruction. Even as Lionel coughed up several mouthfuls of blood, it never wavered. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, just as Meal was about to bound forward one more time, though, an almost shrieking shout called out, stopping him in his tracks. Stop. Stop it right now. Aina's voice caught Meal completely off guard. The fury in his gaze hadn't even waned in the slightest, even meeting Lionel's cold gaze over a distance of several hundred meters. He wanted nothing more than to tear this boy limb from limb. If you hurt him again, I'll never forgive you. Aina spoke with what strength she had left. Please take me away, I don't want to be here anymore. Lionel slid down from the golden barrier, a few cracks quickly mending in his wake. An entire side of his face had become a swollen monstrosity, but the other side maintained a cold indifference that continued to meet Meal's gaze. Meal's body shook with rage. But, when he felt his daughter weakly tugging at his robes, he couldn't help but feel his own heart breaking. There was no rage worth leaving his daughter in this state. He turned his gaze from Lionel, sweeping his daughter into his arms. He sent a glance backward, the crimson in his eyes glowing and his flowing red hair seemingly having become a raging dragon of its own. The oppressive atmosphere in the air seemed to grow palpable. It only became more so after Meal reached out a hand, causing the Brazinger family's heirloom to snap into his palm. In those moments, it felt like the reappearance of a warlord. There was no doubt that had Meal had this blade in his hand, he could have single-handedly wiped the Viola family from existence. Visit. For a better user experience with a step, he vanished from his location, shooting through the rapidly closing gap in the barrier. Lionel could feel his face and body healing exceptionally slowly. There was no doubt in his mind that this was simply the difference between being attacked by a being in the same dimension as you versus one in a higher dimension. Despite the fact most of Meal's strength had been dispersed by the barrier and the fact he was heavily injured, Lionel had still ended up like this. A chorus of boos began to rain down from above. If it wasn't for the barriers, there would likely be a lot of things thrown in Lionel's direction as well. But, his gaze continued looking ahead in the same direction, as though Meal was still standing in the same spot. The rage of the crowd only grew with each passing moment. They vented all their fury and frustration. When what Lionel did sunk in, they became almost feral. Lionel, though, couldn't seem to hear any of it. He had an anger bubbling up within him, but he didn't know where it was coming from. He thought that maybe it was because of Meal, but with his impeccable memory he knew that this anger had been bubbling within him even before Aina's father's outburst. No matter how hard he thought, putting every single one of his split minds to work, he couldn't understand why, and it only made him angrier. Fuck. Lionel's shout was sudden and completely unexpected, drowning out the crowd as though they weren't even there. The barrier to his back shattered and soon after, he vanished, leaving the arena entirely. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Chapter 1199. Lionel's fists fell like a torrential storm. He stood within a cave carved by his own fists, his rage only seeming to become worse with each passing moment. Lionel couldn't ever remember being this absolutely furious before. Every time he tried to consider why that was, he just couldn't pinpoint it, and it fueled his tirade even more. A violent crimson aura hung around him, suffocating his violet fog. The killing intent was so thick and viscous that even the six-dimensional creatures in the surroundings didn't dare to get close. Bang! 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 Blood flew from Lionel's fists and his lips, his body having come nowhere close to healing from Meal's strike. To make matters worse, the mountains of planet Montex were known for their hardness, even to the point they could grow to a height of piercing into space without faltering. Yet, Lionel's fists kept wailing, a harsh and grating whistle emitting from them every time he slammed forward. It was stupid. It was all so stupid. That was the perfect opportunity to use the spider construct on her father, yet he missed it. She was a warrior, maybe even more powerful than himself, yet he had turned her away. Her words had been sincere, and even if he didn't care for them, shouldn't he have at least respected them? Visit. For a better user experience, he couldn't think clearly. His mind was covered in a haze and he couldn't line up his beliefs properly. He was absolutely furious, but he didn't even have a target. He simply kept punching the walls of these mountains. His lungs were screaming, his limbs were on fire, and his bones couldn't even properly heal under the strain he was putting them under. The cave only grew deeper and deeper. Lionel was absolutely relentless, and he didn't even seem to show any signs of slowing down. But while his mind was at one gear, his body was at a completely different one. No matter how much fuel his mind had, his body wasn't in a state where it could keep up. Bang! Lionel's mind tried to pull his body along, forcing it to break into Tier 4. But that was when he rammed into a wall. His feet faltered, his fist missing the wall before him and his body falling to his knees. He tried to stand, but it all suddenly hit him like a ton of bricks. Breathing felt like he was swallowing hot coals, and his blood rushed through his body like molten metal. He coughed and wheezed, mouthfuls of blood and pieces of flesh coming from his lips. Lionel's vision swam, but his mind was still in overdrive. After receiving so much rest over the past few days, it had far too much energy. Even if he wanted to pass out, he couldn't do it, let alone the fact he wanted to continue furiously swinging his fists. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. It was right at that moment that he suddenly felt a palm touch his back. Even in the state his mind was in, he hadn't been able to sense anything before it approached. His head snapped backward, but when he saw what was behind him, his mind went completely blank. It was a woman he had impossibly clear memories of. Those twinkling emerald eyes were all too familiar, filled with warmth and unconditional affection. The cave Lionel's fists had excavated already traveled more than 100 meters in, shrouding everything in complete darkness. And yet, her light smile radiated a light of its own. Alienor kneeled by her son's side, her brows furrowed in worry. She had been fretting over every tiny detail about how she would face her son again, but in the end, her motherly instinct won out. Even if Lionel hated her, she couldn't continue to watch out without doing anything. Seeing the violent aura around her son and the deep crimson taking over his irises, she couldn't help but react this way. What she had never expected, though, was for that violent crimson to vanish almost the instant he laid eyes on her, his eyes even watering. Mom? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, all the reflexes in the world couldn't have prepared Alienor. She found her son's arms being tightly wound around her, causing her to enter a state of shock for a long while. But soon after, she was on cloud 9. Not only had her son recognized her instantly, he didn't seem angry in the slightest. There wasn't even a bit of hesitation in him at all. Alienor wrapped her arms around her son. Feeling the state of his body, she nearly couldn't hold back her own tears. When it came to how Alienor and Velasco wanted to raise their son, they were practically at two opposite sides of the aisle. Velasco would let Lionel jump into a vat of boiling oil even if he knew it was a mistake. He thought that Lionel needed to grow on his own. Even when it came to the treasures he left behind for Lionel, all of them could only slowly unlock their potential under Lionel's own efforts. Alienor, though, would lock Lionel away in a safe room with padded cushions for walls if she could have. The treasures she gave Lionel were instantly valuable and far beyond what even most large families would give their children. If they saw their son in such a state, Velasco would probably force Lionel to heal on his own. Alienor, though, couldn't possibly wait for such a thing and instantly began to use her snow force on him. Meal's influence vanished like a fragrance in the wind, Lionel's body quickly returning to its peak state in just a few breaths of time. However, his grip on his mother only tightened. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Alienor sighed, rubbing her son's back. Though there was a silence between them, Alienor could feel the heaviness of Lionel's spirit. Alienor might not have been there, but she had still watched her son grow up. She knew well that even when Lionel lost his temper, this wasn't how he reacted. Do you regret it? Eleanor finally asked. Chapter 1200. Lionel didn't answer for a very long time. For a moment, Eleanor began to worry about the same thing her own mother had. Had she been away from Lionel's life for too long to be able to ask such a question? Should she have waited longer? But the result wasn't what she thought it would be. I regret how I did it. Lionel's voice was still somewhat hoarse. When he pulled back from his mother's embrace and leaned back against the walls of the cave he had created, a flickering sort of indecision was still within his gaze. He still couldn't understand. How you did it? Eleanor probed. Despite her streak as a clean freak, something she seemed to have only passed on to her son in part, if it was for Lionel, she didn't mind sitting on these dirty floors. There was no need to be so cruel. I don't know why I did that. The words came out before I could even control them. I just don't think I want to be with her anymore and didn't want to give her an opportunity. But I should have figured out another way. You don't? Eleanor looked deeply at her son. Lionel's rage seemed to be fueled by something other than what he said. But she couldn't tell exactly what that was. That said, his statement was as clear as day. Visit. For a better user experience, my mind is too clear and my path is too straight without her. I've made more progress in just a few days than I used to make in months. My head used to be filled with thoughts of her and even the lens I saw the world through was filtered through her first. But when I let go, everything improved. And that's what you want? To follow your path over everything else? It's not what I want. It's what needs to happen. Lionel closed his eyes. This world is filled with nothing but trash. Maybe I was angry because today I became one of them. Eleanor's expression softened even more considerably than it did before, her finger gliding over her son's forehead and fixing the sweaty strands of his hair. And what is your goal? To unite the dimensional verse. Lionel said softly. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Even with his eyes closed, Eleanor could sense the determination of her son. It's quite stupid, isn't it? That's what she said, anyway. Lionel continued. But maybe it is. I left the arena today even though I know how important getting into the Void Palace is, and I don't even feel like appearing for the third day of the selections, not that they would even allow me to make it past. Lionel felt like an idiot. His mistakes compounded. Now he had let himself down and he couldn't even enter the Void Palace anymore. Great on his part, really. Top tier. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Eleanor smiled and shook her head. Her son was clearly still unaware that the tokens were all in her hands. She flipped over a palm and a gem of shimmering amethyst appeared. It was carved into the shape of a coin the size of a palm. On its body, a dark and brooding palace could be seen. Lionel's eyes snapped open. He could feel a strong might coming from the token, a might that could only come from a higher dimensional material. Just looking at it, it was at least on the same level as the memory or Uncle Montez had given him, if not beyond. This is the amethyst token. Mom can give it to you, but you have to promise not to tell your father. He'd throw a fit. Lionel was stunned for a moment before he began to laugh. His laugh was in one part ironic, another part because he truly found the situation to be funny, and a final part sad. This world was truly unfair. Who knew how many were risking their lives for a chance to grasp this amethyst token, yet his mother was handing it to him without him having proved anything. Did Lionel think he could get the token on his own? Yes. But it didn't make a difference to him at all. After all, even if he did earn it the normal way, he would have to rely on talent he was lucky to be born with to do so anyway. Of course, Eleanor didn't care about all of that. She wasn't exactly sane when it came to matters related to her son. Maybe the only reason Miel still had a head on his shoulders was because Eleanor's heart softened for that little girl. But, even then, she didn't reprimand her son. Luckily, it seemed that Lionel was aware of his own mistakes. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel took the token, moving it between his fingers. It carried a great heft to it. Can you give this to her? Lionel asked. Alienor blinked. Are you sure? Every representative is only given a single one. Even I can't get you a second. The advantage of having one is very great. One of my regrets is that I wasn't patient enough for my true talent to awaken and couldn't get one myself. Lionel shook her head. She deserves at least this much for an apology. Revenge for her mother is very important to her, and her luck is less than that of mine. I have you and Dad, but she... Well, anyway, a gold token is enough for me. Alienor smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. This wasn't because Lionel had turned down her goodwill, but because she could hear the affection in her son's voice. And it most definitely wasn't aimed toward her. However, Alienor also understood from her own experience with relationships that no outside party could ever force anything to happen. She would have to wait for Lionel to figure it out himself, and she hoped that it wouldn't be too late for him by then. I guess that little girl isn't so bad. Maybe I can help her out a little bit. On another side of planet Montex, Aina sat in silence, her tears having dried. She looked off into the distance blankly, not even budging when she noticed Savon's presence behind her. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience. You're tuning in to the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.